The blast door was rated to stop a boarding charge, and the Drayth pup went through it as if it were a curtain. Tavril felt the floor of the summit hall jump under his boots before he understood what he was seeing. One moment the far cordon stood sealed, 3 sets of pressure doors, a lattice of shock fence, 12 Vharun guards in ceremonial armor with their crest lamps burning cold blue. The next moment the inner door was folded around a shape the size of a war-hound, and the shape was already low to the ground and moving, 6 legs eating the polished stone in long, terrible strides, straight down the center of the conquered floor. The whole hall came to its feet at once. Envoys of 9 species, the pride of the free verge and the might of the high conquered, 400 of the most powerful beings in this arm of the galaxy, and every one of them recoiled from a cub that had not yet grown its second set of teeth. Tavril did not recoil. He was young enough still to be curious before he was afraid, and so he watched the thing his elders had spent a lifetime learning not to watch. He watched where it was going. It was not charging the dais. It was not charging the guards. It ignored the shock fence tines that raked sparks along its armored flanks, ignored the guards who threw themselves aside, ignored the massed and glittering delegations rising in alarm on every tier. It ran with the single-minded certainty of a thing that has caught a scent it has been dreaming of, and it ran toward the lowest and least of the human benches, where the aides and stewards sat behind their principals, and it did not slow until it reached one plain young woman in a gray steward's coat who had risen to her feet like everyone else, and who, unlike everyone else, was not backing away. She went down to one knee on purpose. She opened her arms. The pup hit her the way a landslide hits a valley, and she took it, rocked back, wrapped both arms around 140 kilos of frightened muscle and plate, and the Drayth, the war beast, the terror of 6 subjugated worlds, the living weapon the High Conquered had brought to this table precisely so that no one would forget what refusal cost. The Drayth pressed its blunt-scaled head into the hollow of her throat and made a sound Tavril had never heard a Drayth make. It keened, high and thin like a much smaller animal, like something that had been lost. And the woman put her mouth against the ridge behind its ear and whispered. Tavril was 40 meters away, on the second tier, with the roar of 400 alarmed voices between them, and still, because the hall had that instant fallen into the particular silence that comes when a great many predators all stop breathing at the same time, still he heard her. Everyone heard her. The acoustics of the conquered dome had been engineered 1,000 years ago to carry a single spoken vote to the last row, and they carried this the same way. "Ember," she said, "little Cole, you remembered me." That was all. 3 small human words and a name that meant nothing in any language spoken at that table. The diplomats froze. Tavril would spend the rest of his life trying to describe that freeze to people who had not been in the room, and he would always fail because it was not the freeze of fear. Fear he had seen. Fear moved, it flinched, it fled, it reached for a weapon. This was the other thing. This was the stillness of 400 trained minds arriving, all together at the same impossible sum, and refusing to believe the total even as they checked the arithmetic again. Because everyone at that table knew what a Drayth was. A Drayth did not keen. A Drayth did not remember. A Drayth bonded to the Vharun bloodline and to nothing else in creation. This was doctrine. This was the cornerstone of 8 centuries of conquered dominance. The reason the High Conquered could set an unmuzzled apex predator loose in a diplomatic chamber as a courtesy and call it a courtesy. The Drayth answered the blood of the Vharun and killed everything else. That was the arrangement of the universe. And a war beast had just torn through a boarding-rated door, ignored the entire High Conquered delegation, ignored its own handlers, ignored the Vharun blood that filled half the room, and gone to a human steward whose name none of them knew, to be held like a child and called by a name in a language none of them spoke. On the high dais, High Envoy Keaton Vosk had risen with the rest. He was very still now, and Tavril, who had served under him for 3 years, who had learned to read the small weather of that scaled and ancient face, saw the thing pass across it that he had never once seen there in 3 years. He saw Keaton Vosk not understand something. It lasted less than a breath. Then the high envoy's crest flattened and his voice came down across the dome, smooth and enormous and absolutely certain, the voice that had ended 2 wars and started a third. "Restrain the animal," Keaton Vosk said. "It is distressed. Houndmaster, collect your charge." And for one more moment nothing in the hall moved at all, because the animal was not distressed. Anyone could see that the animal was, for the first time in its short and weaponized life, entirely at peace. Her name was Wren Halloran, and 11 hours earlier she had been told twice to be invisible. The first time was in the shuttle. Ambassador Ivo Reyes had gathered the human delegation in the cramped forward lounge as Halcyon Reach swelled in the ports, a wheel of white metal 30 kilometers across, turning slow against the dust of a dead nebula, older than any human nation, and rented for the week by powers that could have bought Earth's whole tonnage with their table settings. Reyes was 70 and moved like it, and he had the gift, rare in diplomats, of saying true things plainly. "We are here on sufferance," he had told them. "The conquered did not invite us because they respect us. They invited us because the free verge worlds asked for a witness who owes the conquered nothing, and we are the only power in reach that owes the conquered nothing because we are the only power in reach too new to have borrowed from them yet. That is our entire strength. We watch, we witness, we say little and we do not," and here the old man had looked mildly along the row of aides. "We do not become the story. Someone else's beast, someone else's grief, someone else's war, not ours to touch. Are we understood?" They were understood. Wren had nodded with the rest. The second time was at the cordon 4 hours ago, when the V. Harun protocol officer had run his cold reptilian gaze down the human line and stopped it on her, on the plain young woman at the tail of the delegation with the steward's coat and the unremarkable face and the hands that would not stop wanting to do something. And he had said, in trade standard, "Servants observe from the rear benches. They do not stand. They do not speak. They do not approach the floor." He had said it to her specifically, as if she looked like the kind of person who might forget her place, and she had said, "Understood, sir," in the flat, pleasant voice she used for men who talked to her like that, and she had gone to the rear bench and sat down and been invisible. She was good at invisible. She had spent 4 years being invisible on a frontier refuge station where the work was hard and unglamorous and nobody came, and she had learned there that invisibility was not the same as absence. You could be unseen and still be the most important person in a room. The animals always knew who mattered. It was only people who got confused. So she had sat on the rear bench through the opening rites, through the long call of precedence, through the moment the great doors at the base of the hall had opened and the V. Harun had brought in their beasts. There were 4 of them, full-grown. They came in on braided lines of woven metal held by handlers in reinforced harness, and they came in the way the V. Harun always brought them into rooms full of people they wished to instruct, slow, unhurried, letting the width of them be seen, letting the delegations count the plates of natural armor and the length of the killing spurs, and do the private mathematics of what 4 of these would mean, unleashed, in a corridor or a nursery or a capital. 6 legs. Shoulders at the height of a tall V. Harun's chest. Jaws that could take a bulkhead strut and worry it like a bone. Old scars, some of them, on the 2 eldest, a raking gray line down one flank, a notch bitten from an ear. Wren had gone very still on the rear bench. She knew that flank, she knew that ear. She had been 18 when the transport dumped the cargo pods at Tam Refuge and left without signing the manifest, which was how you knew at Tam that the cargo was something someone wanted forgotten. There had been 6 pods and 41 animals inside them, and 30 of the 41 were already dead, and the 11 that were alive were Draith cubs no bigger than a human infant, half-starved, blind with terror, packed in among their own dead siblings in the dark. The conquered had a word for what those pods were. The word, translated, was surplus. The Vharun bred Draith in the deep wombs of their war moons, and every generation there was a culling. The ones whose bloodlines tested weak, the ones surplus to the warband's needs, and the culled cubs were vented into the dark to die, because a Draith that could not be a weapon was, to the Vharun, nothing at all. This particular shipment had been vented near a shipping lane the Vharun did not know a human refuge station monitored, and Tam's little crew of 11 had gone out in a rock hopper and hauled the pods in because that was what you did at Tam. You hauled in the ones nobody wanted. That was the whole reason the place existed. Everyone had said the cubs would die. The station veterinarian, a kind, exhausted woman named Sefu, had said it first and most often. Apex predators, wrong milk, wrong gravity, wrong everything, weaned too young or not at all, and traumatized past what any animal came back from. They would die, and it would be a mercy, and the humane thing was to let them go quietly. 8 of them had lived. Ren had been the one who fed the smallest. There is always a smallest, and the smallest is always the one the books tell you to give up on, and Ren at 18 had not yet learned to do the sensible thing, so she had taken the smallest cub, a female, a runt, all elbows and fear, who screamed when anyone came near and bit down to the bone when they didn't back off fast enough, and she had sat with it. Not touched it. Just sat, hour after hour, night after night, in the corner of the pen, being a warm, still shape that did not go away and did not grab. She had hummed to it, tuneless, because the silence made the thing panic. She had let it come to the food in its own time and its own way, and when at last, after 3 weeks, the cub had crept across the floor and fallen asleep against her thigh, furnace-hot, trembling, its heart going like a caught bird's. Ren had not moved for 6 hours, until her whole leg was dead and her back was a single locked cramp, because the cub was asleep and the cub was safe, and there was nothing on that station or in that galaxy that could have made her wake it. She had called it Ember, because it had been the last coal in a dead fire, the one everybody said was out, and it had caught. That had been 6 years ago. The Conquered had come for the Draith 2 years later. They had come with lawyers and warships, both, and the lawyers had done the actual work. The Draith of Tam Refuge were, the Conquered's advocates explained, Vharun genetic property, cull stock, yes, technically abandoned. But abandonment did not extinguish bloodline title under Conquered law, and the Conquered did not recognize human salvage rights over Conquered life forms, and the human government, which was new and small and had precisely 1 shipyard, had looked at the warships and looked at Tam's 11 staff, and made the arithmetic every small power makes. They had handed the Draith back, all 8. Grown now, healthy, bonded to the humans who raised them, though the Conquered's advocates recorded them as recovered assets, and would not hear the word bonded, because a Draith could not bond to anything but Vharun blood. That was doctrine. That was the cornerstone. The animals who wept and clung and had to be sedated to be loaded onto the Conquered transport were, the record stated, merely disoriented. Ren had held Ember's head in the loading bay while the sedative went in. Ember had been 3 years old and the size of a draft horse, and had put that whole enormous head in Ren's lap one last time, and Ren had hummed the tuneless hum, and the great gold eyes had gone slow and then closed, and then they had taken her, and Ren had signed the release with a hand that did not shake, because she had promised herself it would not shake in front of them. She had not seen a Draith since. She had transferred off Tam within the year. The refuge was never the same. Everyone said so, though no one said why, and she had drifted into the diplomatic service the way people drift into things, because there was a listing, and she spoke 3 trade dialects from talking to freighter crews, and nobody else wanted the frontier postings. She had made herself useful. She had made herself invisible. She had been, for 4 years, a plain young woman in a gray coat who was good with languages and asked for nothing, and if sometimes at night she woke with the ghost weight of a sleeping furnace against her leg, that was hers, and she kept it to herself, and she did not tell a single soul in the service that she had once raised the monsters the Conquered used to frighten the galaxy. And now she sat on a rear bench in the Concord of Halcyon and watched 4 of those monsters walk in on chains. And 2 of them wore scars she had cleaned herself. And she held so still that Ambassador Reyes, 3 seats up, glanced back at her once, because even an old man who did not know why could feel that something in the row behind him had turned to stone. Then the small door at the beast handler's end of the hall had opened, and a 5th Draithe had come through it. A cub. This year's cull, Wren understood at once. The Concord liked to bring a cub to these things, a small one, cute by the standards of anyone who did not know what it would become, to soften the display, to let some soft-hearted delegate coo at it, and so make the grown beasts beside it seem almost tame. A prop. A pup on a short lead, held by a junior handler, blinking in the great light of the dome. The cub had lifted its blunt head, its nostrils had flared. And across 40 meters of the most heavily secured chamber in the sector, through the massed scent of 400 bodies and 9 species, and the ozone reek of the shock fence, it had found one particular smell that it had never smelled before in its life, and had known, in the way that the culled and the abandoned always know the thing they were denied, exactly what that smell was. The smell of the ones who keep the small ones warm. It had started to pull. The junior handler had laughed and set his weight against the lead. And the cub, which had a name in the Concord registry that was a string of war glyphs and a number, and which had, unknown to every soul in that hall but one, a milk name it had never been given because it had been culled before any human hand could give it one. The cub had thrown itself against the lead so hard that the woven metal snapped, and it had gone through the first door before anyone in the hall had finished turning their head. Wren was already on her feet. She was already stepping past Reyes, past the protocol that said servants do not stand, past 4 years of being invisible, because some part of her older and truer than any protocol had heard the keen start up in that small throat, and had known it the way you know your own name called across a crowd. She went down on one knee on the Concord floor and opened her arms, and the last coal of a fire everyone swore was dead came home to her at a dead run, and she gathered it in, and she pressed her mouth to the ridge behind its ear where the scent glands were, where a Draithe learns its mother, and she gave it at last, 6 years too late, the name she had been keeping for it. "Ember," she whispered, "little coal, you remembered me." She had not meant it for the room. She had forgotten the room. But the old dome gathered up her 3 small words and carried them to the last high tier, and 400 of the most powerful beings in the arm of the galaxy heard a human servant name a conquered war beast in the language of a species they had all agreed to treat as barely more than clever animals, and heard, under the words, something they had been assured for 800 years was impossible. They heard a Draithe answer. Houndmaster Alling had killed Draithe before. It was part of the work that the recruiting glyphs never showed. You raised them and you fed them, and you learned the exact set of their killing spurs. And then, when a bloodline soured or a beast broke its conditioning, you were the one who went into the pen and did the thing that had to be done, because you were the only one it would let close enough. Alling had done it 4 times in 30 years, and each time had cost him something he never got back, and each time he had told himself it was mercy, and each time he had known that mercy was the Concord's word for surplus. So when the cub broke the lead and hit the floor running, Houndmaster Alling did not reach for his goad. He had a full second to read the animal's body before it was out of range, and he had spent 30 years learning to read exactly this, and what he read stopped his hand halfway to his belt. The cub was not attacking. Every line of it was wrong for attack. The spine was loose, the spurs were sheathed, the head was up and open and reaching, and the sound coming out of it, Alling had heard that sound exactly once before, from a Draithe dam who had been shown the body of her whelp, and he had promised himself he would never hear it again, and here it was coming out of a cub at a dead, joyful run toward a human woman in a gray coat. He stood in the middle of the Concord floor with a snapped lead in his hand, and he did the arithmetic that the whole hall was doing, but faster, because he was the only one there who actually knew Draithe, and he arrived at the answer a full 10 seconds before the diplomats did, and the answer turned his stomach to water. He looked at the 4 grown beasts he had walked in on chains. He looked at them properly, the way he had trained himself never to do, because a houndmaster who thinks too hard about the eyes does not last, and he saw that all 4 of them had turned their heads, every one, away from the dais, away from the Harun blood they were supposed to be bonded to unto death. All 4 great scarred heads had come around toward the same corner of the room, toward the woman on her knee, and the 2 eldest, the ones with the gray-raked flank and the notched ear, were straining against their lines with their whole bodies, silent, shaking, in a way Alain had seen Draith strain exactly once before, toward the smell of a pack parent long thought dead. "Restrain the animal," came the high envoy's voice from the dais. "It is distressed. Houndmaster, collect your charge." Alain looked down at the snapped lead in his hand. He looked at the cub, folded into the woman's arms at peace. He looked at his 4 grown killers straining toward her like whelps. For 30 years the conquered had told him the Draith bonded only to Harun blood. He had believed it because his life depended on believing it, and because to not believe it was to understand what he had actually done, 4 times in the pens, with his own 2 hands. "High envoy," Houndmaster Alain heard himself say, in a voice that did not sound like his own, "I cannot collect it." The dome went very quiet. "It is not my charge," Alain said. "It never was." There is a rule in the High Conquered that Keaton Vosk had written himself 40 years before, when he was young and hungry and building the doctrine that would carry him to the highest dais in the sector. The rule was simple: whoever explains the room owns the room. He who is first to tell the others what they just saw becomes the author of what they saw. Keaton Vosk had made a career of being first. So he did not let the Houndmaster's astonishing sentence hang in the air, where it might grow. He stepped to the front of the dais, into the fall of the great crest lamp, and he let the light find the old scars of his own face, the ones he had earned in the pens as a youth, the ones that told every Draith-fearing delegate in the room that here was a Harun who had bled among the beasts and mastered them, and he spoke over the silence before it could finish becoming a thought. "A moving display," he said, warm, amused, vast. "The conquered thanks the human delegation for it." Tavril on the second tier watched the room lean toward that voice the way a field of grain leans toward wind. It was a masterstroke, and he knew it even as it happened. In 9 words, the High Envoy had done 3 things. He had made the impossible into a performance, he had made the performance into a human performance, and he had made himself the gracious host thanking a guest for a diversion. The Draith had not defected. The human had not been recognized. There had merely been an entertainment, provided, how thoughtful, by the small new species at the back, and now the adults would resume. "Clearly," Keaton Vosk went on, strolling the width of the dais now, unhurried, "the servant has some experience with beast handling. Frontier stock, are they not, these humans? Kennel workers and net haulers. One learns a knack. The cub smells the knack and mistakes it for kinship, a common error in immature Draith, well documented, tiresome to those of us who have raised 1,000 of them. A ripple of dutiful amusement from the conquered tier and its client delegations. The animal will be collected, the servant will be returned to her bench, and the conquered will overlook the breach of protocol as a courtesy to our young human friends, who cannot yet be expected to keep their staff in hand." It was, Tavril thought, perfect. It was airtight. It gave everyone in the room a comfortable place to stand. The conquered kept its dignity. The humans were gently patronized back into their box. The miracle was demoted to a knack, and in 90 seconds the summit would resume its scheduled business, which was the slow, courteous, iron-handed process of informing the free verge worlds that conquered protection was no longer optional. And it would have worked. Tavril was certain afterward that it would have worked if the High Envoy had stopped there. But Keaton Vosk had built a career on being first, and he had never in 40 years learned the harder discipline, which is knowing when you have already won. He looked down at the woman on the floor, at the cub folded against her, and some old contempt moved in him, contempt for the frontier, for the small, for the soft-handed species that hauled in surplus and called it saving, and he decided to make the lesson complete. He decided to take the cub back in front of everyone, by his own hand, so that the room would carry away not just the demotion of the miracle, but the image of a Harun high, envoy lifting a conquered beast from a human's arms as easily as taking a toy from an infant. "Bring it here," he said, and started down the dais steps. Ren Halloran looked up. Tavril was watching her face. He could not have said why, except that it was the only calm face in a room full of moving ones. And he saw her look up at the descending high envoy, and he saw that she was not afraid. That was the thing he would remember. In a chamber where 400 powers had just been frightened by a cub, the one human on the floor, with no armor and no weapon and no rank, watched the most dangerous being in the sector walk toward her, and she was not afraid. She was doing something else with her face. She was measuring him. "I wouldn't," she said. Her voice did not carry the way the whisper had. She had not pitched it for the dome. But the dome was silent again, a different silence now, a held-breath silence, and it carried anyway, and it was such an ordinary voice, so flat and plain and unimpressed, that it stopped Keaton Vosk on the third step purely by its wrongness. Servants did not say "I wouldn't" to a high envoy. The grammar of the room did not contain it. "You will not address me," Keaton Vosk said. "I'm not addressing you," Ren said. "I'm telling you what she'll do." She had not risen. She had one arm around the cub, and with the other hand she was, Tavril saw, very slowly and steadily stroking the ridge of scale along its spine, down and down, a motion with no hurry in it at all. "She's a cull cub. You know what that means better than I do. She's been afraid every single day of her life, and she just stopped being afraid for the first time, and you're walking at her fast with your crest up. If you put your hands on her right now, she's going to do what a frightened Draith does when something big comes at the thing it's decided is safe." She looked up at him, mild as milk. "And then you'll have to explain to the room why your own war beast opened your arm in front of the free verge. So, I wouldn't." Keaton Vosk did not move from the third step. And that, Tavril understood, was the moment the room actually turned. Not the breakthrough, not the whisper, but this. A human servant had just described, out loud in front of 400 witnesses, exactly what would happen if the high envoy touched the animal, and the high envoy had believed her enough to stop. Everyone saw him stop. You could demote a miracle to a knack. You could not demote the sight of Keaton Vosk halting on a stair because a kennel worker told him to. The delegate of the free verge for the drowned world of Sesh was called Meru Andwi, and she had come to Halcyon Reach expecting to lose. She was old by the reckoning of her amphibian people, old and scarred and without illusions. She had spent the voyage rehearsing the shape of the surrender, for that was what this summit was, whatever they called it, a surrender dressed as a treaty. The free verge worlds could not hold against the conquered, and everyone in the verge knew it. Sesh had 11 million people, and a single defense platform held together with prayer. When the conquered decided that the verge required protection, protection would be provided, and the Draith walking in on chains that morning had been the whole argument, made without a word. Sign, or one night these come down your corridors. Meru Andwi had watched the beasts come in, and she had felt the old cold arithmetic settle in her gut, and she had thought, "We will sign, and children I will never meet will grow up under the conquered crest, and there is nothing to be done." Then a cub broke a door, and everything she knew about the arithmetic came apart. She watched the human woman stop the high envoy on the stair with 6 flat sentences, and Meru Andwi, who had survived 40 years of verge politics precisely, because she could feel the instant a fixed thing came unfixed, rose from her bench before she had consciously decided to. The verge would hear the servant's name, she said. It was nothing. It was a courtesy, the smallest possible intervention, a request for a name. but it landed in the silence like a stone in a still pool, because it did the one thing Keaton Vosk's whole performance had been built to prevent. It treated the woman as a person whose name was worth knowing. It undid the word servant even as it used it. Keaton Vosk turned his head toward the sesh bench, and his crest moved in a way Meru Andwi had learned, over the long voyage of studying her enemy's recordings, meant displeasure held on a short chain. "The servant's name is not the business of this table," he said. "The Verge disagrees," said Meru Andwi, and her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. "The Verge was brought to this table to be shown the Concord's beasts, as a demonstration of what the Concord's friendship spares us. We have been shown the beasts. And the beasts, it appears, have shown us something in return. The Verge would like to know the name of the person your war animals prefer to you." She let that sit for exactly one heartbeat. "It seems suddenly relevant to the question of whose protection we are being offered." Somewhere on the human benches, an old man laughed, a single dry huff, quickly stilled. Ambassador Ivo Reyes, Meru Andwi would learn later, who had spent the whole incident with his hands folded in his lap, and his face composed in an expression of profound diplomatic neutrality, and who had just heard the entire architecture of the summit turned upside down by a delegate from a drowned world, and could not, for 1 second, quite keep it off his face. "Her name is Ren Halloran," Reyes said, rising, smoothing the moment over, taking the floor before the Concord could seize it back. He was very calm and very old, and he spoke to the whole dome. "She is a steward of my delegation. She has, as the High Envoy correctly surmised, some background with animals. She worked, before her service, at a frontier refuge station. I confess I did not know the particulars until this moment." He inclined his head, first to the sesh delegate, then with exquisite courtesy to the dais. "And I confess the High Envoy has the right of it. This is a distraction from the table's business, and I apologize for my staff. Ren." He turned to her and his voice gentled. "Bring the cub to the handler and come back to your seat." He was, Meru Andwi understood, throwing the miracle away. Deliberately. Handing the room back to Keaton Vosk, diffusing the crisis, returning his small dangerous steward to invisibility, because Ivo Reyes had come here to witness, not to become the story, and he could feel a story trying to eat his delegation alive, and he was old enough and wise enough to want no part of it. It was the correct move. It was the safe move. It would have worked. Ren Halloran did not do it. She did not defy him exactly. She simply looked at the cub in her arms, and then she looked at the 2 eldest Draithe still straining silent against their lines at the handler's end of the hall, the gray-raked flank, the notched ear, and something crossed her ordinary face that Meru Andwi, from the sesh bench, read as clearly as if it had been spoken. Recognition, not the cub recognizing her recognizing the grown ones. "Ambassador," Ren said, without heat, without drama, in that same flat, steady voice, "I'll come back to my seat. I will, but not to that handler and not to him." She did not look at Keaton Vosk when she said him. "Because those 2 by the wall are named Greyfall and Notch, and I set that ear when she tore it on a cargo grill when she was 4 months old. And I've got no intention of handing this baby to the people who threw all 3 of them out an airlock to die." And there it was at last, laid on the Concord floor in front of 400 witnesses, in the plainest human words. Not a knack, not a coincidence of scent. She had named the beasts. She had claimed the scars. She had said airlock and die and thrown out, and every delegate in that dome who had spent the morning being quietly terrified of the Concord's war beasts felt the terror turn over in their chest and become something else, something with a sick, dawning shape to it. Meru Andwi looked at the 4 grown Draithe straining toward the human woman, and for the first time in her long life, she did not see weapons. She saw survivors. Tavril found that he had stopped breathing and made himself start again. He was 22 years old in the reckoning of his people, which made him barely more than a cub himself by the standards of the dais, and he had come into the diplomatic service the way ambitious young V. Harun did, believing every word of the doctrine because the doctrine was the ladder he intended to climb. Draithe bond to the blood. The conquered protects. Surplus is mercy. He had recited these the way children recite the multiplication of numbers, as things too fundamental to question. Now he stood on the second tier and watched a human woman say airlock, and he did the thing that would, in the end, define the rest of his life. He believed her instead of the doctrine. It was not a decision. It was simpler than a decision. He looked at Greyfall and not straining against their lines, and he had walked past those two beasts 100 times in the delegations holding decks, had seen the way they went flat and still and dead-eyed when a Viharun approached, had been told that was discipline, that was proper conditioning. A well-broken Draithe is a quiet Draithe. And now he watched those same two dead-eyed beasts come alive, at the sound of a human woman's voice, weeping toward her in the only way their kind could weep. And he understood that he had spent 3 years walking past grief and calling it discipline. "That's a lie," said someone, and Tavril realized with a lurch that the someone was himself. He had not meant to speak. He was on the second tier, among the junior Concord staff, in the row where you were seen and not heard for a decade before anyone let you near a microphone, and he had said "that's a lie" into the silence of the dome loudly enough that heads turned. His superior, first attaché vessel, gripped his forearm hard enough to bruise. But it was out, and the dome had carried it, and Keaton Vosk's ancient head was turning slowly toward the second tier to find the young fool who had spoken. And Tavril discovered that having started, he could not find it in himself to stop. "The conditioning," Tavril said. His voice shook. He let it shake. "We're told it's discipline. We're told a quiet Draithe is a well-broken Draithe. I've stood the holding decks for 3 years. High Envoy, I've watched Greyfall go flat and dead when we come near, and I called it discipline because that's what we're taught to call it." He swallowed. "But it isn't discipline. It's grief. It's a beast that's been taken from the thing it loved and knows it can't get back, so it goes quiet, the way anything goes quiet when hoping only gets it hurt. And it just got its hope back, and now we can all hear exactly how quiet it had been keeping. I'm sorry, High Envoy. But that is not a neck, that is a mother." Vessel's grip went slack with horror. On the dais, Keaton Vosk had gone entirely motionless, and Tavril, 22, ruined, free, met the ancient eyes and did not look away. "You are relieved," Keaton Vosk said quietly. "Vessel, remove him." "He asked," said Meru Andwi of Sesh before Vessel could move, and the young attaché answered. The Verge found the answer clarifying. "We would ask that the young attaché remain." She spread her webbed hands, mild, immovable. Or does the High Envoy fear what his own juniors have seen on his holding decks? The trap closed with a sound Tavril could almost hear. To remove him now was to admit there was something to hide. To let him stay was to let the words that is a mother stand in the record of the summit. Keaton Vosk had spent the morning building a room where the conquered owned every explanation, and in the space of 10 minutes a cub, a servant, a drowned world delegate, a houndmaster, and one disgraced junior attaché had built a different room around him, and he was standing in it, and he could feel the walls. "Let the child stay, then," Keaton Vosk said, with a lightness that fooled no one, "and learn what sentiment costs at a serious table." He descended the last steps to the floor slowly, his crest high, reclaiming the space by the sheer old gravity of himself. "Since the Verge is so moved by frontier animal husbandry, let us by all means put the matter plainly and be done with it, and return to the business these theatrics have delayed." He stopped 10 paces from Ren Halloran. Close enough to loom, not close enough, Tavril noticed, to be within reach of the cub. "You claim these animals," Keaton Vosk said. "Very well, claim them. Here now before the table. Stand human and call your beasts to you, all of them, and if they come, the conquered will concede that you have some rustic bond with Kulstock, and the Verge may make of it whatever comfort it likes." His voice dropped, and only the frontiers heard the edge come into it. "And if they do not come, if these are, as I say, merely confused animals responding to a familiar reek, Then you will have shamed your ambassador and your infant species in front of the entire sector, and we will muzzle the cub and we will proceed. Those are the stakes you have chosen, girl. Not I. Stand and call them. It was, Tavril saw, the High Envoy's counterstroke, and it was nearly as good as his first. He had turned the miracle into a wager, and rigged the wager with the one thing no one could control. 4 traumatized apex predators, in a strange, loud room full of the smell of everything that had ever hurt them, chained by handlers of the species that had thrown them away. Even if the bond was real, and Tavril no longer doubted it was real, the odds that all 4 grown Draith would obey a human voice, here, now, under this much fear, against their conditioning and their chains, were not good. Keaton Vosk was betting on the fear he himself had spent years installing in them. He was betting that his own cruelty had done its work too well for love to undo in one afternoon. The dome was utterly silent. Wren Halloran rose to her feet. She did it slowly, the cub gathered against her chest, and she looked at the 4-chain Draith across the length of the conquered floor, and Tavril watched her face do the arithmetic of it, watched her understand the wager and its rigging and its cost, watched her know that she might well lose. Then she did a thing that Tavril did not understand until much later. She did not call the Draith. She set the cub down. She bent, and she put the pup gently on its 6 feet on the cold conquered stone, and she took her arms away from the one warm certain thing in that whole terrible room, and she straightened, empty-handed, defenseless, and Tavril's heart clenched because it looked like surrender. And then he saw the cub, freed, look up at her, and he understood that it was not surrender at all. It was faith. She was showing the room that she did not need to hold the animal to keep it. She was betting her whole self, in front of the sector, that love did not require a chain. "I'm not going to call them," Wren said, to Keaton Vosk, to the dome, to the 400. "You call them by name and you drag them by the throat and you tell yourself that's how it works because that's the only way it's ever worked for you." She lifted her chin toward the handler's wall, toward Greyfall and Notch and the 2 younger ones. "I'm not going to call them, I'm just going to stand here." Her voice did not rise. It did not have to. "And we'll see who they'd rather be with." And she stood there, ordinary and empty-handed in her gray coat, and she waited. Houndmaster Alin stood at the wall with 4 braided metal leads wrapped twice around his forearm and locked in his fist, and he felt the wager come down onto his shoulders like a collapsing roof. Because the wager would be decided by him. Not by the woman, not by the High Envoy, by whether Alin, when the moment came, let the leads run. That was the ugly private truth of it that no one on the floor could see. The Draith were not free. They were chained, and the chains ran to his fist, and a houndmaster who had spent 30 years learning the exact tension at which a Draith would gentle, and the exact tension at which it would break could feel, right now, through the woven metal, 4 animals leaning toward that woman with a want so total it made his arm shake. He could hold them, that was his craft. He could set his weight and lock his stance and hold all 4 against the wall by main strength and long training, and the Draith would strain and fail to reach her, and the wager would be lost, and Keaton Vosk would win, and the summit would proceed, and the verge would sign, and children on drowned Sesh would grow up under the crest, and it would be Alin's doing. Alin's fist. The whole ruin of it would run down 4 leads to one old houndmaster, who had spent his life telling himself that mercy was the conquered's word for surplus, that a quiet Draith was a well-broken Draith, that the flat dead eyes on the holding deck were discipline. The young attaché's words were still in the air. That is a mother. Alin looked at Greyfall. 30 years of craft told him everything about the beast in one glance, the loose weeping strain of the neck, the sheathed spurs, the head lifted and open, every line of the body saying the one thing a Draith almost never got to say, which was please. He had set that ear himself, the woman had said. She had said it, actually. He remembered the file now, the recovery file the Concord's advocates had scrubbed and sealed. Frontier Station, salvaged cull stock, injuries treated by unlicensed human handlers. He had read it as evidence of trespass. He read it now as a list of the things she had done for them that he never had. "Houndmaster," said Keaton Vosk, without turning, in the tone of a man reminding a tool of its function. "Hold your charges. Let us see whether love outpulls a chain." And Alain understood that the High Envoy had just told him, in front of the sector, to be the villain, to hold the leads, to make the cruelty with his own hand so the High Envoy stayed clean. He had done that 4 times before in the pens, with the quiet ones. He had told himself each time it was mercy. Houndmaster Alain opened his fist. He did not fling the leads down. He was too old a hand for melodrama, and part of him, even then, could not quite make his body throw away 30 years all at once. He simply, deliberately, uncurled his fingers and let the braided metal run free off his forearm, loop by loop, and he said, to no one, in the flat voice of a man laying down a burden he should have set down long ago, "I'll not hold them. Not for this, not again." The leads hit the floor. For one heartbeat nothing happened, because the Drave did not understand that they were free. They had spent years learning that the chain always won. Greyfall took a lurching half-step, hit the phantom end of a tension that was no longer there, and flinched, the great scarred killer, flinched at the memory of a chain, and Alain felt something in his own chest tear at the sight of it. Then Notch, the younger of the 2 eldest, put her notched ear back and made the connection, and she came off the wall. She did not charge. That was the thing that broke the room. A charging Drave the delegates could have understood. They had braced for a charging Drave all morning. Notch did not charge. She crossed the conquered floor at a low, fast, desperate lope, spurs sheathed, head down and reaching, and 40 meters out she began to make the sound the cub had made. The Keen and Greyfall broke a half-second behind her, making the same sound. And then the 2 younger ones. And then all 4 grown Drave of the High Concord's delegation were streaming across the great dome floor toward a plain woman in a gray coat, keening like lost whelps, and the sound of it, 4 apex predators weeping, went up into the 1,000-year acoustics and filled the dome to its crown. Ren Halloran did not brace, she did not flinch. She opened her arms the way she had for the cub, and she went down to meet them, and they came into her all at once, 100 kilos and 140 and 200 each of scarred killing muscle folding down around one small human like a closing hand, and she vanished into them, and from inside the pile of beasts came her voice, muffled and steady and utterly without fear, saying their names: Greyfall, Notch, "Oh, look at you, look how big." And the cub wormed in among the grown ones to press against her, and the 4 adults lowered their terrible heads over her, and the pup both, and made a wall of themselves, a living fortress of the Concord's own weapons, with the woman safe at the center of it. Meru Andwi of Sesh stood at her bench with her webbed hand pressed to her mouth, and she wept, and she did not care who saw. Tavril on the second tier felt first attaché vessel let go of his arm entirely and glanced over, and saw that his superior, a hard, cold climber of 30 years standing, was staring at the pile of beasts with an expression Tavril had never seen on a V. Haroun face at a serious table. It took him a moment to name it. It was shame. And on the conquered floor, 10 paces from a fortress of his own war beasts built around a human woman, High Envoy Keaton Vosk stood entirely alone, in the fall of the great crest lamp, and watched 800 years of doctrine come apart in front of the entire sector. The thing about Keaton Vosk, the thing his enemies never understood, and the thing that had made him deadly for 40 years, was that he did not panic when he lost the room. He had lost rooms before. He had built his career not on never losing but on what he did in the 60 seconds after, when a lesser envoy would flail or bluster or concede. In those 60 seconds Keaton Vosk went very cold and very clear and looked for the single move that would turn the whole board. He looked at it now. The beasts, the woman, the weeping Sesh delegate, the ruined attaché, the traitor Houndmaster. He looked at the free verge benches and saw the fear he had spent a year cultivating their curdling into something far more dangerous, hope. He looked at the human ambassador, that composed old creature, and saw him already calculating how little his species could get away with saying while this did all their work for them. He looked at the whole beautiful machine of the summit, the machine that had been minutes from delivering the verge into the conquered's hand, and he saw it seizing, and he understood that persuasion was finished. The room could not be talked back. So he stopped trying to win the room, and he reached instead for the thing that had always been under the room, the thing the Draithe were only the polite advertisement of. He reached for the fear itself. "How touching," Keaton Vosk said. He said it quietly, and the dome carried it, and something in the flatness of it made the weeping stop and the dome go still again, because every diplomat in that room had, at some point in their career, heard a powerful being decide to stop being polite, and they all knew the sound. "How very touching," the high envoy said again, and he turned, unhurried, and walked back up the steps of the dais, and when he reached the top he did not sit. He stood at the rail and looked down at the fortress of beasts and the woman inside it, and he let the room see him be patient, be amused, be entirely unbothered, and it was the most frightening thing Tavril had ever watched a person do. "The verge is moved," Keaton Vosk said. "The humans are vindicated, the animals have chosen love. It is a very fine story, and I imagine it will travel, and I find I do not mind if it does, because the story you are all telling yourselves right now, the story where love has beaten the conquered, rests on a small assumption that none of you have thought to check." He smiled, in the way his kind smiled, which showed the teeth. "You have assumed the animals are the point." He lifted one hand and made a gesture, small, precise, two clawed fingers turning as if adjusting a dial, and on the far wall, where the conquered's technical staff sat behind their consoles, a young officer went rigid, hesitated, and then, under the weight of 40 years of trained obedience, entered a command. Greyfall screamed. It was nothing like the keen. It was a sound of pure animal agony, and it tore out of the oldest Draithe and doubled it over, and then Notch screamed, and then the two younger ones, all four grown beasts convulsing at once around the woman they had made themselves a wall for, and Ren Halloran was suddenly visible again as the fortress came apart into four thrashing bodies, and she was on her knees among them with her hands out, useless, unable to understand or stop what was happening to them. "Neural governors," Keaton Vosk said, over the screaming, conversational, patient, letting the room hear every word. "Standard issue in all field-deployed Draithe for 2 centuries. A courtesy to the delegates, in truth, you did not really imagine we would bring unmuzzled apex predators into a diplomatic chamber with nothing but a chain, did you? The chain is theater. This is the leash." He turned his hand again a fraction, and the screaming dropped from agony to a broken whimpering, 4 huge bodies pressed to the floor, shuddering. "They feel what I decide they feel. They always have. The bond you find so moving is real. I do not dispute the child at HFY's tender diagnosis. It is a mother, how sweet, but it is also, and this is the part the verge should attend to very closely, entirely beside the point. The animals may love whom they like. They will obey what is wired into their spines. As I would gently suggest," and here he lifted his gaze from the beasts to the free verge benches, and the amusement went out of his voice and left only the iron, "will everyone else at this table in the end love the conquered or not?" The dome was silent, except for the whimpering of the Draithe. And Tavril understood that Keaton Vosk had found his move. He had lost the argument about love, so he had thrown the argument about love away, and he had shown the room the thing under the room, that it did not matter whom the beasts loved, because the conquered did not require love. The conquered required only a wire in the spine and a hand on the dial, and that was an argument that worked just as well on drowned worlds as it did on war beasts. He had turned the humiliation into a threat. He had made the whole sector watch him hurt the thing it had just learned to love, precisely so that it would understand he could. Meru Andwi sat down slowly on the sesh bench, and the hope went out of her face, and the old cold arithmetic came back into her eyes, and Tavril saw the summit begin, horribly, to swing back. Wren Halloran knelt among the shuddering beasts with Greyfall's great head heaving in her lap, and she looked up at the dais, and her ordinary face had finally, at last, changed. It was not fear. Tavril had waited all morning for the human to be afraid, and even now she was not afraid. It was something he had no word for in his own language and would only later, studying the humans, learn the shape of. It was the face of a person who has just been shown exactly how much cruelty a thing is capable of, and has decided, quietly, in that instant, that she is going to end it. Wren had one hand flat on Greyfall's skull, feeling the tremors run through the bone, and she was doing something she had learned at Tam that had nothing to do with diplomacy. She was counting. You learned it with traumatized animals. You learn to go still and cold and useful in the middle of their pain, because your panic was one more thing they could smell, and one more thing that made it worse. And the single most helpful thing you could be for a screaming animal was a person who was not screaming. So while the dome rang with the aftermath of Keaton Vosk's demonstration, while the Verge's hope curdled, and the human delegation sat frozen, and the whole summit tilted back toward the conquered, Wren Halloran knelt in the wreckage with her hand on an old friend's head and made herself the calmest thing in the room, and she counted. She counted the governors. 4 grown beasts, 1 cub, but the cub had not screamed. She filed that. 5 Draith and only 4 had gone down. The cub was cull stock, brought as a prop, a last-minute soft touch. Maybe they had not bothered to wire a governor into a beast they intended only to parade and then, she had no doubt, quietly dispose of once the summit was done. 1 free. She counted the distance, the technical staff on the far wall, the console. The young officer who had entered the command and who was not, she noted, looking at the beasts, who was looking down, hard at his own hands, the way people look when they have just done a thing they will not forgive themselves for. She filed that too. She counted what she knew about neural governors, which was more than Keaton Vosk could possibly have guessed, because at Tam they had pulled a governor out of the 9th cub, the one that died during the necropsy, trying to understand what the conquered had done to these animals before it threw them away. Sephu the veterinarian had spent a week on it. Wren had held the instruments. She knew what a governor looked like and where it sat, and, crucially, she knew the one thing about it, that the conquered's whole doctrine of control depended on no one outside the conquered ever knowing. She knew it was a receiver. It did not generate the pain. It received a signal and translated it. And a receiver, Sephu had said, turning the small, bloody thing over under the light 6 years ago, is only ever as good as the assumption that no one else has the key. Wren looked up from Greyfall's shuddering head. She did not look at Keaton Vosk. She looked instead at Houndmaster Allen, who stood by the wall where he had dropped the leads, ashen, staring at the beasts he had just freed, writhing under a pain he had no part in and could not stop. "Houndmaster," Wren said. Her voice cut through the dome, flat and clear and carrying, and it was not a plea. It was the voice of one professional to another. The governors, they're keyed to a command channel. You know the channel, you've stood these decks 30 years, you know the frequency they broadcast on, you've heard the technicians set it 100 times. She held his eyes. I need you to tell me I'm right, that it's an open receiver, no handshake, no pairing. Just a channel and a code. Because the conquered never once imagined anyone but the conquered would ever have a transmitter. Allen stared at her, the whole dome stared at her. And Tavril on the second tier watched the old Houndmaster's face move through confusion into understanding, into something that might have been the first hope he'd felt in 30 years, and heard him say in a cracked voice, yes, it's an open receiver. It has to be for field swap of handlers. There's no pairing, just the channel and the envoy's code. His throat worked. But you don't have the code. Only the command dais has the code. Only. I don't need his code, Wren said. And she reached into the inner pocket of her plain gray steward's coat, past the credentials and the stylus and the folded protocol card, and she took out a small battered device that no one had thought to confiscate from a servant, because servants carried tools, and this looked like exactly the kind of dull utility tool a kennel worker would carry. And it was. That was precisely what it was. At Tam, Wren said to the dome, to Keaton Vosk, to the sector, standing now, the device in her hand, the cub pressing against her leg. We pulled one of these governors out of a cub that didn't make it. And we spent a long time learning what it was, because we wanted to understand what had been done to them before we got them. And do you know what we found out, High Envoy? She turned at last to face the dais, and her plain face was very calm. We found out you never changed the channel, not in 200 years. Why would you? Nobody outside the Concord had ever had one of these to study. Nobody outside the Concord had ever pulled one out of a dead baby and sat up nights with it, trying to learn the frequency of the thing that hurt them. She lifted the device. I did. I built this 6 years ago. I've carried it every day since, because I promised myself if I ever stood in a room with a governor going off, I'd have the answer in my pocket. And I have stood in that room. And I do. Keaton Vosk's hand at the rail went still on the invisible dial. You're bluffing, he said. But for the first time all day, Tavril heard it, the hairline crack under the enormous voice. A frontier servant does not carry a Concord command transmitter in her coat. No, Wren agreed. A frontier servant carries a jammer, and she pressed her thumb down on the battered little device, and every neural governor in the Concord of Halcyon went deaf. The screaming stopped. Tavril felt the absence of it before his mind caught up, the way you feel a machine you have lived beside for years switch off, a pressure lifting that you had stopped knowing was there. The four-grown Draithe, which had been pressed flat and shuddering against the Concord stone, went still. Not the stillness of the flat dead holding deck eyes he had walked past for 3 years. A different stillness. The stillness of an animal that has been in pain for so long it has forgotten there is another way to be, discovering, second by second, that the pain is not coming back. Greyfall lifted his head out of the woman's lap. He did it slowly, as if the head weighed more than it should, and he turned it, and he looked around the great dome, at the massed delegations, at the crest lamps, at the dais, and the figure standing at its rail with one hand frozen on an invisible dial. And Tavril, who had spent 3 years learning to read Draithe, and calling what he read discipline, watched the oldest of the Concord's war beasts look at the Concord for the first time in his life, without a wire in his spine telling him what to feel. It was not a comfortable thing to watch. Reset the channel, Keaton Vosk said. He had not moved from the rail. His voice was still smooth, still enormous, but Tavril heard the thing under it working faster now. Technical staff. The governors are being jammed on the field frequency. Shift the command channel and reestablish. Now. The young officer at the far console, the one who had entered the command, the one who had been staring at his own hands, did not move. Officer, Keaton Vosk said. It won't shift, High Envoy. Another technician, older, was working frantically at the adjacent console, and his voice climbed with each word. The governors are hardware locked to the field frequency. That's the whole design. They can't be rechanneled from the dais. It's a safety. So a captured beast can't be turned against us on a new. He stopped, hearing himself, hearing the shape of the thing the design had never anticipated. That the field frequency, the one unchangeable channel, the channel no one outside the Concord could ever possibly have, was exactly the channel a frontier veterinarian had spent 6 years ago pulling out of a dead cub and learning by heart. It can't be rechanneled, the technician said very quietly. There's no override. The field frequency is jammed and there's no override. For 200 years, the immovability of the governor's frequency had been the Concord's guarantee. Now it was the Concord's cage. Wren Halloran got to her feet in the middle of the Draithe. She kept her thumb on the little device. She did not gloat, Tavril noticed that, filed it, the way she did not once look pleased with herself, the way she simply stood there holding down a button like a woman holding a door shut against weather. Around her, one by one, the 4 grown Draithe rose. They rose the way Tavril imagined mountains would rise if mountains could decide to. Greyfall first, unfolding all 6 legs, coming up to his full and terrible height, 2 meters at the shoulder, the crest lamp finding the old gray scar down his flank. Then Notch. Then the 2 younger ones. They rose around the woman and the cub, and they did not press in on her now, did not weep or cling. They turned outward, all 4 of them. They came up onto their feet and turned to face the room, and they arranged themselves, without a command, without a sound, with the terrible unhurried certainty of animals that have finally been allowed to be what they are, into a ring, with Ren Halloran and the cub at its center, and every one of the 4 great scarred heads pointed out, toward the room, toward the guards, toward the dais. It was a formation. Tavril had seen the diagrams in the Warband manuals. A Draithe pack in protective ring, quills of a single animal. He had been taught it was the most dangerous configuration an apex predator could adopt, that a pack in ring around a thing it had decided to protect would not be turned, would not be reasoned with, would die to the last before the thing at the center was touched. He had been taught it took a V'Harun warlord's whole bloodline authority to command it. A human woman in a gray coat had produced it by holding down a button, and she had not even asked. "High Envoy," said First Attaché Vessel, very low at Tavril's side. He had gone gray. "High Envoy, this is enough. We should withdraw the delegation and—" "Be silent," said Keaton Vosk. He came down off the dais. The young officer at the console was named Senat, and he was going to be sick. He had entered the command. That was the fact he could not get out from under. When the High Envoy's fingers had turned in that small, precise way, the way that meant governors, every trained reflex in Senat's body had reached for the keys before his conscience could reach for his hand, and he had entered the command that made the beast scream. And now he stood at his console with the taste of bile in his throat and watched the animals he had hurt rise up whole around a human woman, and he thought, "I did that. When she says who did this, it was me." He had joined the Concord Technical Corps because it was the only ladder out of the War Moon creche where he'd been bred, and he had told himself, the way you tell yourself things on a ladder, that he only entered commands, that the commands were someone else's, that a hand on a key is not a hand on a throat. He had told himself that for 6 years. It had lasted exactly as long as the first time he heard what his keys actually did to a living thing at close range, with the acoustics of a 1,000-year dome to make sure he heard all of it. Keaton Vosk was walking toward the ring of beasts. He had summoned the hall guards with a flick of 2 fingers, and they were forming up 12 V'Harun in ceremonial armor, the same 12 whose cordon the cub had shattered, and they carried ceremonial arms that were, Senat happened to know, because he maintained the charge logs, not ceremonial at all. Full power. The High Envoy did not travel with theater. "The human," Keaton Vosk said to the guard captain, not troubling to lower his voice, because the time for the room's opinion was past, and he wanted the room to understand that it was past, "has jammed a Concord command frequency in a Concord chamber. That is not a breach of protocol. That is an act of sabotage against Concord military assets, committed by an agent of the human government, in the presence of the entire sector." He was speaking to the guard captain and to the Free Verge both, Senat realized, building the record even now, even here, laying down the story in which the Concord was the victim of a human attack. Disable the device. Detain the agent. If the animals interfere, and here he paused, and Senat saw him weigh it and saw him decide, put them down, all of them. They are compromised assets, and we have a hall full of witnesses to the danger they pose. The guard captain hesitated. It was a small thing. It lasted less than a second, but Senat saw it, and so did the room, because everyone in that dome was watching the guards now the way you watch the one loose stone above you on a cliff. The captain hesitated, looked at the ring of beasts, at the woman, at the 12 guns of his own detail. And then, because he was a Concord officer and 40 years of doctrine does not evaporate in an afternoon, he raised his arm and gave the order, and the 12 guards advanced on the ring. Senat's hand was already moving. He would think about it afterward for the rest of his life, and he would never be able to say that he decided. It was the woman's face that did it, maybe, the way she had looked at him across the hall once and filed him, and not with hatred, with something worse, with the plain, unsurprised recognition of a person who has met a great many people who only entered commands. Or maybe it was simpler. Maybe 6 years of bile had finally come up. But his hand was moving before his mind gave it leave, across his own console, to the master environmental board that a technical officer of his grade could touch, and a high envoy could not, and he killed the crest lamps. The Concord of Halcyon dropped into darkness. Not total, the emergency floods came up along the floor a half-second later, low and red and swimming. But for that half-second the great dome was black, and in the black Senate heard the guards falter and the delegations cry out, and he heard under it 4 sets of 6 clawed feet move on the stone with a speed that no armored guard in that hall could have matched even in full light. When the red floods came up, it was over. Wren had felt the dark come down and had understood it at once as a gift. Someone in this room was on her side and had bought her 3 seconds, and she had spent the 3 seconds doing the only thing that mattered, which was to stay exactly still and let the Draith work. Because you did not, ever, get between Draith and a threat they had decided to answer. The most dangerous thing she could have done in that dark was move, or make a sound of fear, or reach for one of them. Anything that read as panic, anything that made them think the thing at the center of the ring needed help rather than stillness. So Wren Halloran stood in the pitch dark of the most dangerous room in the sector with a cub pressed to her legs and 12 armed guards advancing, and she made herself the calm, still center, and she trusted the animals she had raised to be exactly what 6 years of conquered cruelty had made them, and what 4 years of human gentleness had kept alive underneath it. When the red light came up, 4 guards were on the floor. They were not dead. Wren checked that first, with a fast professional sweep of her eyes, because a dead guard was a war and a disarmed guard was a lesson, and she needed this to be a lesson. 4 were down pinned, each with 200 kilos of Draith standing over it and a set of jaws closed, not biting, just closed, around a helmet or a weapon arm or the back of an armored neck, holding with the exquisite calibrated restraint of an apex predator that has been asked by the thing it loves, its whole life long, to be gentle, and has learned the difference between gentle and harmless. Their weapons were scattered across the floor, knocked from their hands. The other 8 guards had stopped where they stood, arms half raised, because they had just watched 4 of their detail taken out of the fight in the dark without a single shot fired and without a single throat torn, and they had understood all at once the thing Keaton Vosk had spent the afternoon refusing to let them understand. The beasts were not compromised. The beasts were choosing, and the beasts could have killed and had chosen instead to disarm, which meant every guard in that hall was alive on the sufferance of a human woman's wish that they should be. Notch stood over the guard captain with her notched ear flat and her jaws around the back of his neck plate, and she was looking at Wren. They were all looking at Wren. 4 grown Draith with 4 conquered guards pinned under them, and every one of the beasts had its eyes on the woman at the center of the ring, waiting. Waiting to be told whether to close the jaws. The whole dome understood what it was seeing. Tavril understood it. Meru Andwi understood it. Keaton Vosk, standing alone now in the red light with his guard detail broken around him, understood it best of all that the question of who ruled this room had just been reduced to a single clean fact, which was that the Concord's own weapons were awaiting a human's word on whether to spare the Concord's own soldiers. "Wren," said Ambassador Ivo Reyes. He had risen from the human benches. He came down onto the Concord floor, an old man moving carefully in the red light, and Wren understood that he had finally decided to stop being only a witness. And she understood why, because there was a thing happening here that was too big now for a steward to hold, and a good ambassador knows the exact moment to take the weight off his people and carry it himself. Ren, Ray said again, gently reaching her. Tell them to let go. They will, Ren said. When it's safe, not before. She had not raised her voice. She was looking at Keaton Vosk. Tell your guards to stand down, High Envoy, all the way down, weapons on the floor. And then my friends will let yours up, and nobody in this room will have to explain to their government why they died at a peace summit. She paused. That's the deal. That's the only deal. I raised these animals to be gentle, and I will not have them made into killers in front of the whole sector just so you can save face. So call it off. Now. And there it was, the thing the niche of the moment turned on, the thing every being in that dome would carry home to their own worlds. The human had the conquered's throat in her hand, 4 throats, 12, the whole delegation's, and what she was asking for was not surrender and not vengeance and not power. What she was asking for was that nobody had to be hurt. She was standing in the wreckage of 800 years of conquered dominance with the means to make it bleed, and she was using that means to keep it from bleeding. And the contrast of it, the gentleness at the exact center of all that lethal capacity, was more devastating to Keaton Vosk than any threat could have been. Because a threat he could have answered, a threat fit the world he had built. This did not fit anywhere. Stand down, Keaton Vosk said. The words came out of him like stones. Guards, stand down, weapons on the floor. It should have ended there. Tavril believed later that it could have ended there, that if Keaton Vosk had been a smaller man, or a wiser one, he would have taken the loss and the survival both, withdrawn the delegation, and spent the voyage home building the version of events in which the conquered had shown restraint. That was the move. Everyone on the dais could see it was the move. But Keaton Vosk had spent 40 years being the being who explained the room, and he could not, in the end, bear to be a being to whom the room was explained. He watched his guards lay their weapons on the floor. He watched the Drave, at a low word from the woman, open their jaws and step back and let the 4 pinned guards crawl free. He watched the ring reform around her, calm now, unhurried, the cub yawning at its center as if none of it had cost anything at all. He watched the free verge benches, and he saw Meru Andwi of Sesh rise a second time, and he knew what she was rising to say, that the Verge had seen enough, that the Verge would not be signing, that the demonstration of conquered power had become, instead, the most complete demonstration of conquered weakness the sector had witnessed in 3 generations. And Keaton Vosk decided that if he could not win the room, he would at least deny it its clean ending. A transmitter, he said. He said it to the dome, and the old dead certainty was back in his voice, and it made the room go still because it was the voice of a being reaching for his last card, and everyone could hear that he had won. The human has told you a story about a jammer, Keaton Vosk said. A frontier device built from grief, a mother's clever tool, very moving. But consider, delegates, what you have actually seen. You have seen a human agent carry into a sealed conquered chamber, past our cordon, a device capable of seizing control of conquered military assets. You have seen her use it to turn 4 apex predators against a conquered guard detail. You call it protection. I call it what your own governments will call it when they read the record, a human weapon tested on conquered soldiers in front of the sector. He turned to the free verge, and his voice was iron and honey both. You were brought here to choose a protector. Choose wisely. The conquered's beasts are open in their nature, you see the teeth. But this, he leveled one clawed finger at the small battered device in Ren Halloran's hand. This is a species that walks into a room looking like servants, carrying tools that look like nothing, that can take the mightiest weapons in the sector out of the hands that hold them and turn them on their masters. Look at her, plain, harmless, invisible, and she has just disarmed the high conquered in its own hall. He let it land. Which of us, Verge, should you truly be afraid of? It was, Tavril thought, genuinely brilliant and genuinely evil, and for one cold moment it worked. He felt it work, felt the free verge benches waver, felt the fear that Keaton Vosk had spent a year building find a new and even more frightening object, because there was a horrible truth buried in the lie. The human had done all of that, and she did look plain, and there is nothing the powerful fear more than a quiet person who turns out to hold the key to the wire in your spine. For one moment the summit hung in the balance a third time, and might have swung the Concord's way after all, on the strength of one old envoy's refusal to lose gracefully. Then Ambassador Ivo Reyes began, quietly, to laugh. It was not a large laugh. Reyes was 70 and tired, and he had spent the whole afternoon watching a summit he had come only to witness turn into something that would be taught in academies for 100 years, and the laugh that came out of him was small and dry and genuinely, helplessly amused, and that was exactly why it was fatal. A defiant laugh Keaton Vosk could have crushed. This one just sounded like an old man who had heard something honestly funny. "Forgive me," Reyes said, wiping at one eye, straightening, becoming the ambassador again but keeping the warmth, because he had felt the room waver and he knew that against the High Envoy's iron the only counter left was to refuse entirely, to be afraid. "Forgive me, High Envoy. It's only, you asked the Verge which of us they should be afraid of, and you pointed at Ren, and I looked at where you were pointing, and I want everyone in this room to look with me. Please, look at what the High Envoy is asking you to be afraid of." He gestured gently at Ren Halloran, at the plain young woman in the gray coat, standing in a ring of the Concord's own beasts, holding down a button, with a cub yawning against her leg. "A weapon," Reyes said. "He says she carried a weapon into this hall, and she did. Let's not pretend otherwise. The High Envoy is right about the object. She carried a device that can silence the wires the Concord puts in the spines of living animals. That is what it does. That is all it does." He turned to the Free Verge, and his voice lost its amusement and found something older and harder underneath. "So ask the real question, delegates. Not is it a weapon. Ask, why does it exist? Ask what a frontier veterinarian would have to see to sit up 6 years building a device whose only purpose in all the universe is to make the Concord's torture stop. Ask what was done to a baby animal, on a table in front of her, that a plain young woman would carry the antidote to that specific cruelty in her coat pocket every single day for 6 years, on the chance, the tiny chance, that she might one day be in a room where she could use it." The dome was silent. "He calls her a weapon," Reyes said, "but a weapon is a thing you build to hurt. She built the only thing in this sector designed from the ground up to make hurting stop. He's not afraid of a weapon, delegates. He's standing in front of the first tool ever made that his cruelty has no answer to, and he is very, very afraid, and he is trying to teach you to be afraid of it too, because if you are afraid of the cure then you will keep buying the disease." The old man spread his hands. "The Concord's power was never the beasts. You all saw that today. The beasts were never loyal, they were wired. The Concord's power was that no one else had ever held the key to the wire, and now the secret is out and it turns out the key was never a secret weapon at all. The key was this: pick up what they throw away, feed the ones they starve. Sit in the dark with the ones they've decided are surplus, and don't grab and don't leave and wait. That's the whole key. That's the entire terrifying human technology the High Envoy wants you to fear." He looked for a long moment at the ring of beasts, at the old scar on Greyfall's flank. "We're not the ones who put wires in their spines. We're the ones who were there when they woke up screaming and stayed. If that makes us the frightening ones," he turned back to Keaton Vosk, and he was not laughing now, "then yes, High Envoy, be afraid. You built an empire on the certainty that no one would ever love the things you discard, and you were wrong. That's all this is. You were wrong about that one thing, and everything else you built stood on top of it." Meru Andwi of Sesh rose for the third and final time. "Free Verge," she said, and her voice did not shake at all now, "was brought to Halcyon Reach to choose a protector. We have made our choice." She looked at the ring of beasts and at the woman and at the old human ambassador, and then she turned deliberately to the dais, to Keaton Vosk, and she gave him the full measure of the thing he had spent the afternoon trying to prevent, which was the sight of a small power that was no longer afraid. "We choose no protector. We withdraw from the accord of protection." And we ask the human delegation not as protectors. We have had enough of protectors. We ask them as witnesses, to carry the record of what happened in this hall to every world in the verge and beyond it, so that every people the conquered has ever frightened with its beasts will learn the two things we learned today. She held up one webbed finger, that the loyalty was a lie, a second finger, and that the lie has a cure and the cure fits in a coat pocket and its name is kindness and the conquered cannot jam it. She sat down. Sesh has spoken. The verge stands with Sesh. And down the long benches of the free verge, one by one, the delegates of the drowned and the burned and the frightened worlds rose to their feet and stood, and did not sit back down. And Keaton Vosk watched a year of patient work and 800 years of doctrine dissolve into a hall full of standing enemies. And for the first time in 40 years, the being who explained the room had nothing left to say. Tavril thought it was finished. He thought, watching the verge stand, that he had seen the end of it, the humiliation total, the accord dead, the delegation's only remaining task to withdraw with what dignity it could scavenge. He had forgotten about the old law. Almost everyone had. That was rather the point of it. It was first HFY Vessel who remembered. Vessel, the hard, cold climber who had gripped Tavril's arm hard enough to bruise not an hour before, and who now stood beside him gray-faced and staring at the ring of Draith with that same unfamiliar shame. Tavril heard him make a small sound, a sharp intake, the sound of a man reaching back through years of training to something he had been made to memorize as a youth and had never once expected to use. "The rune veil," Vessel said. He said it quietly, but Tavril was beside him and heard it, and he saw 2 or 3 of the oldest Vharun on the conquered benches turn their heads sharply, because they had heard it too, and the words meant something to them that they clearly wished it did not. "Adeshe," Tavril said. Vessel's throat worked. Then he did a thing that Tavril would remember as the bravest he ever saw a Vharun do at a serious table, which was to step forward, to the rail of the second tier, into the sight of the whole dome and his own ruined high envoy, and to say, in the formal cadence of conquered law, loud enough to carry, "I invoke the rune veil, the old law of the pens. I ask the table to hear it." Keaton Vosk's head came around like a struck thing. "You will not," he said. "It is my right as a Vharun of the blood to invoke it," Vessel said, and though his voice shook, it did not stop, and it is the table's duty to hear it, and if the high envoy silences a lawful invocation in front of the free verge, then the high envoy admits before the sector that the conquered's own law is a thing it keeps only when convenient. He turned from Keaton Vosk to the dome, to the standing verge, to the ring of beasts, and Tavril saw him gather himself and become, in front of everyone, something better than the climber he had been that morning. "The rune veil is the oldest law of my people, older than the conquered, older than the war moons. It comes from the age when we first took Draith out of the deep caves and learned to live beside them, before we learned," his voice caught, "before we learned to put wires in them. And it holds this, that a Draith is not property, that a Draith cannot be owned, only kept, and that the keeping is decided by the Draith and by the Draith alone, and that whosoever a Draith chooses as its keeper holds a claim over that beast that no bloodline, no warband, no conquered, and no high envoy may overrule. The choice of the beast is sovereign. That is the old law." He looked at Ren Halloran standing in her ring. "We buried it. We buried it 800 years ago when we built the war moons and the governors, because you cannot breed a beast for war and also let it choose its own keeper. The two things cannot both be true. So we chose the war moons and we called the old law a superstition, and we stopped teaching it to anyone but law students, who memorize it as a dead thing, a curiosity, a relic of the caves." His voice dropped. "It is not dead. It was only sleeping, the way the beasts were sleeping, and it just woke up, and it says, in the plainest words my people ever wrote, that those 4 Draith and that cub belong to the human, not by salvage, not by sentiment, by the oldest law the Vharun ever made. They chose her, and the choice of the beast is sovereign." The dome erupted. Tavril could not afterward reconstruct the next minute. It was all voices, the conquered benches on their feet, the oldest V. Harun shouting vessel down, and others shouting them down in turn, the law speakers among the delegation flipping frantically through their codices, because a thing everyone had agreed was decorative had just been aimed, loaded, at the center of the room. But through all of it, he watched Keaton Vosk, and he saw the high envoy do the arithmetic one last time, faster than anyone, and arrive at the ruin of it before the rest of them. Because the old law was real, that was the horror of it for Keaton Vosk. It was genuine V. Harun law, unrepealed. They had never repealed it, they had only buried it, because repealing it would have meant admitting out loud that the war moons violated it, and the conquered did not admit such things. It simply stopped speaking of them. The law had sat in the codices for 8 centuries precisely because everyone was too proud to strike it out. And now a disgraced first attaché had read it back into the light of a summit hall in front of the Free Verge, and there was no clean way to unsay it. To deny the rune veil was to confess, before the sector, that the conquered had spent 800 years knowingly breaking its own most sacred law. To honor it was to hand 4 war beasts and a cub to a human woman, by V. Harun law, in front of everyone. Either way the beasts were hers, either way the doctrine was dead. It is a dead law, Keaton Vosk said into the uproar, but even he could hear that it was not enough, and the uproar did not quiet. It is a curiosity of the caves. It has not been invoked in 800 years. Because for 800 years, said Houndmaster Alain, no Draith was ever allowed to choose. He had come forward from the wall. The old Houndmaster who had dropped the leads, who had killed Draith 4 times with his own hands and called it mercy, walked out to the edge of the ring of beasts, and the beasts let him, Tavril saw, they let him come, the man who had chained them, because the woman at the center did not tense when he approached, and so they took her stillness as permission. And Alain stood there in the red light and addressed the whole dome in the flat certain voice of the only being present who actually knew the animals in question. I have kept Draith for 30 years, Alain said. I have raised them and fed them and put them down when the wire soured them, and I have called it discipline and I have called it mercy. And this afternoon I learned that I never once in 30 years saw a Draith choose anything because I never once in 30 years let one. The wire chooses, the warband chooses, the high envoy chooses, the Draith lies flat and goes dead-eyed and we call it a well-broken beast. He looked at Greyfall, at the old gray scar, and his voice cracked and he let it crack. The old law isn't dead. We just never let it come up. You cannot invoke a beast's choice in a species that is never permitted to choose. And today, for the length of an afternoon on a jammed frequency, 4 Draith got to choose for the first time in 800 years, and every single one of them chose her. He turned to Keaton Vosk, and there was nothing deferential left in him at all. So don't tell the table it's a dead law, High Envoy. Tell the table you kept it dead on purpose. That's the truth of it, and I helped you, and I'm done. Senat, at his console, watched the conquered delegation come apart, and understood that he had killed the lamps for this. Not for the woman in the end, though it had felt like the woman in the dark second when his hand moved. For this. For the sight of first attaché vessel and Houndmaster Alain standing at the edge of a ring of freed beasts telling the truth in front of the sector, and for the fact that once the truth was out in a room that large, no hand on any dial could pull it back. He had spent 6 years believing he only entered commands. It turned out a technical officer could enter 1 command of his own. He keyed the environmental board again and brought the crest lamps back up slowly to full, so the whole dome came out of the red emergency dark into clean white light, and everyone in it was visible to everyone else, no shadows to hide in, no darkness to disavow later. If they were going to break the conquered's oldest lie, Senat thought, they were going to do it with the lights on. In the full light, the ring of Draith looked less like a weapon, and more like what it was, which was a family standing guard. The cub had fallen asleep against Ren Halloran's boot. Greyfall's great scarred head had lowered until it was nearly level with the woman's, and she had, without seeming to think about it, laid one hand flat on the bridge of his snout, the way you would steady a horse or reassure a child, and the oldest war beast of the High Conquered had closed his eyes at the touch. Keaton Vosk looked at the closed eyes, at the flat human hand, at the whole impossible tableau lit now in merciless white, and Tavril watched the last of it leave him. Not the anger. The anger would stay, Tavril suspected, for the rest of the old envoy's life. What left him was the thing that had made him dangerous, the certainty, the absolute unshakable knowledge that he understood the room and the room did not understand him. He had lost that. You could see him lose it. He stood in the center of the Concord of Halcyon, under the full light, surrounded by standing enemies and fracturing subordinates and a law he had buried and a woman he could not explain. And for the first time in 40 years, High Envoy Keaton Vosk did not know what to say. Into that silence, Ren Halloran spoke. She did not speak to Keaton Vosk. She had, Tavril noticed, more or less stopped acknowledging the High Envoy's existence some time ago, had filed him, the way she filed everyone, and moved on to the things that actually needed doing. She spoke instead to Houndmaster Alain, in the plain working voice of one professional to another, as if the two of them were the only ones in the room and there were work to be done, which, for the two of them, there was. "The cub's exhausted," she said, "and these 4 are running on nothing but adrenaline and 6 years of missing me, and when that crashes it's going to crash hard, and I'm not going to have them crash in front of 400 strangers under lights like an interrogation." She said it flatly, practically, the concerns of a keeper. Is there somewhere on this station big enough and quiet enough to bed down 5 Drave? Because that's what happens next. Not a vote, not a ceremony. They need to sleep, and I need to be where they can see me when they wake up, or we start all the way back at the beginning with the trust, and I don't have another 6 years. And Houndmaster Alain, who had kept Drave for 30 years and never once been asked by anyone what the Drave needed, looked at her for a long moment, and something in his old scarred face eased, and he said, "The lower holding decks. Warm, quiet, dark if you want it dark." He paused. "I know the way. I'll take you." "You'll take us," Ren agreed. She bent and gathered the sleeping cub up into her arms again, and straightened, and the 4 grown Drave rose out of their ring and fell in around her without a sound, a loose protective diamond, and she looked at last up at the dais. One glance, brief, unimpressed, the glance you give a man on your way out of a room you are finished with, and then she turned her back on the High Envoy of the Conquered and walked toward the handler's door, and the beasts went with her. And the whole sector watched the Conquered's weapons walk out of the Conquered's hall at the heel of a human steward, and not one hand in that room could have stopped them. The lower holding deck was a long vault of warm dark metal that smelled of straw and machine oil, and under that of Drave, a musk Ren had not smelled in 6 years, and that undid her, a little when the door cycled open and it rolled out to meet her. She stood in it a moment and let herself feel the thing she had been holding off since the cub hit her on the Conquered floor, and then she folded it back up and put it away, because there was work, and the work came first. The work always came first. That was how you survived loving animals. Alain showed her the deck and then, to his credit, got out of the way. He knew 30 years had taught him at least this, that what happened next was not a thing a keeper did with an audience. He posted himself at the door, arms folded, an old man standing a watch he had never in his life stood for the right reasons before, and he let the woman do her work. Ren set the cub down in the deepest, warmest corner, in a drift of straw, and the cub woke enough to circle 3 times and flop, and she sat down in the straw beside it with her back against the warm bulkhead, and then she waited. They came to her the way she had known they would. Not all at once. The crash was starting, the adrenaline draining out of 200 kilos of animal apiece, and with it the terrible 6-year discipline of the wire, and what was left underneath was exhaustion and grief, and a need so old and so long denied that it could only be approached slowly. Notch first. The younger of the 2 elders crept across the deck on her belly, the notched ear flat, making small sounds, and Wren did not reach for her. She held still, the way she had held still 18 years old in a cargo pen, being a warm shape that did not grab and did not leave, and she let Notch come the last distance on her own terms and put that great scarred head down in the woman's lap. And only then, only when the beast had chosen the contact, did Wren lay her hand on the notched ear she had set with her own fingers half a lifetime ago. "There," she murmured, tuneless, the old hum starting up under the words, the one that made the silence bearable for a frightened thing. "There you are, look how big you got. Look at you." Greyfall came next, and then the two younger ones, whom she had known as yearlings and who were strangers and not strangers now, grown into their scars, and one by one they folded down around her in the straw until she was buried in Draithe again the way she had been on the conquered floor, except that here there was no room to freeze and no sector to perform for, and the beasts could finally stop being weapons and just be tired and grieving and home. Greyfall pressed his flank against her side, and she felt the old scar under her arm, the raking gray line she had cleaned and packed and cleaned again through 3 weeks of infection when he was a yearling, and everyone said he would lose the leg. And he had not lost the leg, and here it was, healed, enormous, warm, rising and falling with his breath against her ribs. Wren Halloran sat in the straw in the belly of an alien station with 5 apex predators asleep against her and her back to a warm bulkhead, and she did not move, though her leg went dead, and then her whole left side, because they were asleep and they were safe, and there was nothing in that station or that galaxy that could have made her wake them. She had done this exact thing once before, 6 years and a lifetime ago, and had it taken from her. She was not going to let it be taken again. 2 decks up, in a requisitioned briefing room, the conquered delegation was tearing itself apart, and Tavril had a seat at the table for it, because a summit that has broken its own oldest law needs young law students to read the codices aloud, and Tavril had been, that morning, a young law student, before he became the fool who said that's a lie into the dome. The invocation of the rune veil had done something none of them could stop. It had turned an internal humiliation into a legal fact, and a legal fact was a thing even Keaton Vosk could not simply out-talk. The old law existed. It had been invoked lawfully by a V. Harun of the blood. And that meant the delegation now had to do the one thing Keaton Vosk had spent his whole career ensuring the conquered never had to do, which was to adjudicate its own conduct against its own law in front of witnesses. "The rune veil cannot apply," said Councillor Thren, oldest of the delegation's law speakers, "because the rune veil predates the domestication of the Draithe as war assets. It speaks of cave Draithe, wild-caught, beasts that had never been bred or conditioned. These," she gestured at nothing at the absent beasts at the whole afternoon, "these are war stock, bred, governed, property of record. The old law of the caves does not reach them." "The old law," said Vessel, who had earned his place at this table by invoking it and who had, Tavril saw, decided somewhere in the last hour that he no longer cared what it cost him, "makes no distinction between wild-caught and bred. Read it. It says a Draithe, not a wild Draithe, a Draithe. The distinction you are drawing is one we invented 800 years later precisely so that this law would not reach our war moons. We cannot now use the distinction we invented to escape the law to prove the law does not apply. That is not adjudication. That is a child hiding evidence." "You forget yourself, attaché." "I remember myself," Vessel said. "That is the whole difficulty." Tavril watched the argument go around the table, and he understood that it was not really an argument about law. It was an argument about which humiliation the conquered would choose, because there was no path left that did not end in one. If they ruled the rune veil did not apply, they would have to explain why, and every explanation reduced in the end to "we changed the beast specifically so this law could not protect them," which was a confession of 800 years of bad faith, delivered to a sector full of standing enemies. If they ruled that it did apply, they handed the beasts to the human, and admitted that the conquered's whole doctrine of Draithe loyalty had been, in the sight of the sector, a lie enforced with wire. And there was a third thing, the thing none of the law speakers would say out loud, the thing Tavril could see moving behind every face at that table. The free verge had already left. The accord was already dead. Whatever the delegation ruled about 5 Draith on a holding deck, the actual power the conquered had come to Halcyon to project was gone, spent, burned in an afternoon, and no ruling could bring it back. They were arguing about the disposition of 5 animals. In the ashes of the thing, the 5 animals had burned down. "There is a way to end this cleanly," said Keaton Vosk. He had been silent for a long time. He sat at the head of the table with his crest low and his hands folded, and he had let the law speakers exhaust themselves. And now he spoke into their exhaustion in the old smooth, certain voice, and Tavril felt the room lean toward it out of pure habit, and hated that it did. "The old law binds us only so long as the beasts exist to be claimed," Keaton Vosk said. "The rune veil grants the human a claim over 5 specific animals. It grants no claim over the war moons, over the breeding stock, over the doctrine. It is a small law about specific beasts. So," he unfolded his hands, "we concede the 5. Tonight, quietly, we sign the beasts over to the human under the old law, the very picture of conquered honor, bowing to its own most ancient tradition, how it will play, and we withdraw. And somewhere in the long voyage home, on a war moon far from any witness, 5 Draith that have been compromised beyond recovery, that have been turned against a conquered guard detail, that pose a documented danger, 5 Draith quietly cease to be a problem. And the old law, having no beasts left to bind, releases us. And in a generation, this afternoon is a story the Verge tells that no one can any longer check against a living animal, because the animals are," he moved one hand, the small precise gesture, the one that had made Greyfall scream, "gone." The briefing room was silent. Tavril felt the cold come up his spine. He understood all at once that Keaton Vosk had just proposed to murder the 5 Draith, Greyfall, Notch, the 2 younger ones, the cub asleep against the woman's boot 2 decks down, not out of rage, but as a legal instrument, a way to dissolve the old law by dissolving the things it protected. Concede the claim, honor the tradition in public, and then quietly destroy the evidence in the dark, exactly the way the shipment had been vented near Tam 6 years ago, exactly the way the conquered had always solved the problem of things that had become inconvenient. Surplus. Mercy. The conquered's oldest reflex, reaching for the oldest solution. And he understood something else, colder still. That a day ago, a week ago, he, Tavril, would have sat at this table and thought it a clever move. He would have admired the elegance of it. He had been raised to. He stood up. "No," Tavril said. The word came out steadier than that's a lie had in the dome. He had had some practice now. "I am the junior-most person at this table," Tavril said, "and I have no standing, and I am probably going to spend the rest of my life regretting the next thing I say, and I find that I do not care. High Envoy, what you have just proposed is a crime under the same law you are proposing to use it to escape. The rune veil does not only grant the human a claim. Read the whole of it. I read the whole of it this morning before any of this because I am a law student and it was in the codex and I was bored. The rune veil says the choice of the beast is sovereign. Sovereign. And it says that to raise a hand against a Draith that has lawfully chosen its keeper is not damage to property. It is a killing. It is murder under the old law, the same as killing the keeper. We wrote it that way in the age of the caves because we understood then that the beast and its keeper are one thing, and that to kill the chosen beast is to try to kill a part of a person." He was shaking. He let it shake. "You cannot dissolve the old law by killing the beasts, High Envoy. You can only commit, in the dark, on a war moon, the exact crime the whole sector already suspects us of. And this time it will be true. And this time there will be a houndmaster and a first attaché and a law student who heard you propose it at this table. I heard you propose it." He looked around the room at the frozen loudspeakers, at Vessel, at Counselor Thren. We all heard it. Nobody at the table said anything for a long moment. Then Counselor Thren, oldest of the loudspeakers, who had spent the last hour arguing that the rune veil did not apply, set down her stylus and said, in the dry, cracked voice of a very old being who has just watched a line cross that she did not believe even Keaton Vosk would cross, "The attaché reads the codex correctly. That is what the old law says." She looked at Keaton Vosk, and there was something final in it. "I have served the conquered for 90 years, High Envoy, and I have defended a great many things at this table that I did not wish to defend. I will not defend that. If you move against those animals, you do it against the law, against the codex, and against the recorded objection of your own delegation." She began, deliberately, to gather her codices. "I am going to go and put my objection in the record now, while my hand is still steady. I suggest, attaché Vessel, that you do the same." Senat was not in the briefing room. Technical officers of his grade did not sit at adjudications. But technical officers of his grade maintained the station's internal comms, and Senat had spent the hour after the dome not sleeping. He was never going to sleep again, he suspected, but sitting at a maintenance terminal in the deck below the briefing room, listening, because he had already crossed every line there was, and there was nothing left to protect by not listening. He heard Keaton Vosk propose to kill the Drave. He heard the law student refuse, and the old counselor refuse, and the delegation begin, one careful voice at a time, to put its objections in the record, and he understood that the record would not be enough. A record was a slow thing. A record protected you in a hearing 3 months from now on a homeworld in front of a tribunal. It did not protect 5 sleeping animals 2 decks down tonight. If a high envoy who had just lost everything decided that everything included his patience for the law. Because Keaton Vosk had not agreed to anything in the briefing room, Senat had listened to the whole of it, and the high envoy had proposed the killing, and been refused, and then he had gone very quiet, and the quiet was worse than the proposal. Senat had maintained this man's systems for 6 years. He knew the shape of that quiet. It was the quiet of a being who has stopped trying to persuade the room and started instead to act around it. Senat pulled up the station's internal movement logs. A foreguard detail, not the ceremonial detail, the other one, the quiet one that traveled with the high envoy and did not appear on any protocol roster, had just drawn heavy suppression gear from the delegation's arms locker. Signed out under a maintenance code, the way you signed things out when you did not want them in the record, and they were moving, down, toward the lower holding decks, toward the warm, dark vault where a human woman sat in the straw with 5 sleeping Drave and her back to a bulkhead, and her whole heart in her lap. Senat looked at the movement log for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened a comms channel to the one person on the station he thought might listen, and he hoped to every dead god of the War Moon Creche that the old Houndmaster had kept his earpiece in. "Houndmaster Alling," Senat said, very fast and very low. "This is Technical Officer Senat. I killed the lamps in the dome. You don't know me, but you know I'm on your side now. Listen to me. There's a 4-man suppression detail coming down to the holding decks, and they didn't sign for restraint gear, they signed for suppression, and I have listened to the high envoy propose to put those animals down tonight, and I think it's happening right now. You need to wake her up." His voice cracked. "You need to wake her up, and you need to get those beasts on their feet, because the Conquered is coming down to the holding deck to finish what it started 6 years ago, and this time there's no dome full of witnesses, and this time it's just her." Ren woke because Greyfall woke. She had not meant to sleep. She never slept on a first night, not with animals this raw, but the warmth and the weight and the 6 years of held breath had taken her under despite herself, and she surfaced not to a sound but to a change in the body pressed against her side. Greyfall had gone from the loose, heavy sprawl of deep sleep to something else between one breath and the next, rigid, awake. His head was up. And Ren, who had spent 4 years learning to read the exact language of a Drave's shoulders in the dark, came fully awake in half a second, because the language his shoulders were speaking was one she had hoped never to see again. Thread. Easy, she breathed, not a command, a tether. Her hand found the ridge of his spine in the dark. Easy, I'm here. What is it? Show me. The holding deck door was cycling. She heard it now, the soft mechanical sigh of a lock being overridden, quiet, careful, the sound of people who did not want to be heard. And under the door, along the floor, a thin blade of corridor light widened, and into it stepped 4 shapes in heavy armor, and even in the dark, even half asleep, Wren knew the silhouette of suppression gear when she saw it, because she had seen it exactly once before in a loading bay 6 years ago, pointed at animals she loved. Behind her, the other Draith were waking. She felt them come up out of the straw, felt the deck shift with the rising of 200 kilos, 4 times over, and she heard the cub whimper and press against her boot, and she felt the whole ancient reflex of the pack gather itself in the dark around her, and she understood that she had about 3 seconds to decide what kind of night this was going to be. Because they would kill. She had no illusion about that, not anymore, not after the dome. In the hall they had disarmed, because she had been calm and the room had been bright and they had taken their cue from her stillness. But this was the dark, and this was suppression gear, and these were animals that had spent 6 years wired against their own nature and had just that afternoon been let off the wire, and every instinct in every one of them was screaming that the thing at the center of the ring, the keeper, the mother, the one warm certain thing in a lifetime of cold, was about to be taken again. They would not disarm. In the dark, woken to a threat, they would open throats. And she would not be able to stop them once it started. And 4 dead conquered guards on a holding deck was a war, was the end of everything the afternoon had bought, was exactly the story Keaton Vosk needed, the human weapon, the killer beasts, the massacre in the dark. He wanted them to kill. That was the trap. Wren understood it in the space of one breath. He had lost the dome, so he had come down to the dark to make the beasts do the one thing that would turn the sector's horror back onto her. 4 guards was not the objective. 4 guards was bait. Lights, Wren said. She did not whisper it. She said it clear and flat and loud, and she was gambling that somewhere in this station, the man who had killed the dome lights was still listening, still on her side, still 1 step ahead, and she won the gamble because the holding deck lit up. Not emergency red. Full white work lights, every panel all at once, the deck flooding with hard, clean light, and the 4 guards in the doorway flinched and threw up their arms, blinded, their suppression gear built for a dark massacre suddenly useless in a vault lit up like a surgery. And in that half-second of their blindness, the Draith moved, and Wren moved with them, up onto her feet, 1 hand out, and she did the only thing that could keep this from becoming a war. She got in front of them. She stepped out of the ring into the light between her animals and the guns, a plain young woman in a rumpled gray coat with straw in her hair, and she put her body in the line the Draith wanted to charge down, and she said, in the enormous calm carrying voice of a keeper who has spent her whole life being the thing that does not panic, Greyfall, Notch, all of you, hold. They held. It was the most terrible thing Olin ever saw, and he was in the doorway to see it. He had come at a dead run 2 decks down the moment Senet's voice cracked in his ear, and he arrived at the holding deck door just behind the suppression detail, in time to see the lights come up and the woman step into the gap and 4 apex predators mid-lunge. At the absolute peak of a killing rage 6 years in the building, stop. Stop dead. 200 kilos apiece of muscle and spur and fury, halted in the air by 2 words from an unarmed woman, held quivering on the edge of a violence that every fiber of them was built and wired and grieved into wanting, held there, shaking, spurs out now, jaws wide, close enough to the guards that the lead man made a sound no soldier ever once recorded, held, and not released, because she had told them to hold and they would sooner die than fail her. You came down here in the dark, Wren said to the 4 guards, and her voice did not shake, and Olin understood that this was the most frightening thing about her, that she never once raised her voice, with suppression gear, to put down 5 sleeping animals, so your high envoy could tell the sector my beasts are killers. And they nearly obliged you. Look at them. Look how close you came. She did not move. Behind her, Greyfall's whole body strained against the single word she'd laid on him, a sound coming out of him now that was pure murder held on a thread. The only reason you are alive is that I raised these animals to listen to me even when everything in them says don't. That's it. That's the whole margin you're standing in. And I want you to carry that back up to the being who sent you. The difference between your soldiers living and dying tonight was one human woman's word, and she chose to let you live, and she is getting very, very tired of being the only person in this whole affair who keeps choosing that. The lead guard lowered his weapon, slowly, and then the others. Greyfall, Wren said, softer now. Easy, easy, my old friend, stand down, they're leaving. And the oldest war beast of the High Conquered shuddered, and the murder went out of him by degrees, and he backed off the killing edge one reluctant step at a time. And when he had backed all the way down, he turned and put his great scarred head against the woman's chest and shook, and she wrapped both arms around it and held it. And the contrast of it. The thing that had, 1 second ago, been an eyelash from tearing 4 soldiers apart, now trembling like a struck child in a woman's arms, was the thing that broke the last of Houndmaster Olin, standing in the doorway, and made him, at 58 years old, put his hand over his eyes. That was the moment Keaton Vosk arrived. Tavril arrived at the same time from the other direction, at a run, with Vessel and 2 station security officers, and Counselor Thren moving as fast as her 90 years allowed. Because Senet had called them too. Senet had called everyone. Senet had spent his last shred of career opening every channel he had, and telling every being who might matter exactly where to be. And so, it was that the High Envoy of the Conquered came down to the holding deck to quietly finish a 6-year-old crime and found. Instead of darkness and a massacre, a vault lit up like a courtroom, full of witnesses. He stopped in the doorway. Tavril, arriving behind him, watched him take it in. The lights. The 4 guards standing down, weapons lowered, alive. The woman, unharmed, with straw in her hair and a war beast's head against her chest. The station security. Counselor Thren with her codices. Vessel. And the record, Tavril understood, the record was here in all these bodies, in all these eyes, the thing the High Envoy had come down to the dark specifically to act outside of, and it had gotten here first. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Keaton Vosk did the thing that finished him, though Tavril did not think he even knew he was doing it. He looked at the 4 guards standing down, and the old fury moved in his face, and he said to them, to his own soldiers, in front of station security and the council and the witnesses, he said, I did not order you to stand down. And there it was, in front of everyone. Not I came to check on the animals. Not this is a misunderstanding. He had walked into a room full of witnesses and, out of pure ungovernable habit, out of 40 years of a certainty that his word remade any room, he had confirmed the order. He had told the whole deck plainly that he had sent 4 soldiers with suppression gear into the dark, and that he was angry they had not used it. Counselor Thren closed her eyes. High Envoy Keaton Vosk, she said, and her old voice filled the vault, formal now, terrible, the voice of conquered law itself finally turning to look at the being who had spent 40 years assuming it never would. You have, before witnesses, confirmed an order to destroy 5 Draith lawfully claimed under the Rune Veil. Under that same law, an attempt upon a lawfully chosen beast is a killing. You have attempted a killing. I am the senior law speaker of this delegation, and I am invoking the sanction of the Codex, and I am relieving you of your commission here, now, in front of these witnesses, pending a tribunal of the homeworld. She turned to the station security officers, who stood frozen, and to Vessel. First attaché Vessel is senior of the blood present and unimplicated. The delegation is his until the homeworld says otherwise. Secure the former High Envoy. Gently. We are not the conquered he made. We do not do our killing in the dark. Keaton Vosk did not resist. Tavril had expected, braced for some final eruption, some last terrible move, because he could not imagine this being simply ending. But there was no move left. Every board was overturned. His guards would not lift a hand for him. They had just been shown in the plainest possible terms exactly what his orders were worth against a human woman's word, and they had chosen, standing in the light, to be the soldiers she let live rather than the killers he sent. His delegation had turned. His law had turned. The beasts had turned. The sector had turned. There was nothing left to explain, and no room left to explain it to. And Keaton Vosk, who had ended 2 wars and started a third, who had built 800 years of doctrine into a personal instrument, who had walked into the Concord of Halcyon that morning as the most powerful being in the sector, let 2 station security officers take him quietly by the arms and lead him out of a holding deck at the heel of a 90-year-old law speaker, past a human steward with straw in her hair. And he did not look at the woman as he passed, and the woman did not look at him. She had filed him, hours ago. She had more important things in her arms. When they had all gone, the guards, the security, the council, the deposed high envoy, it was Tavril who stayed, and Alain, and hovering uncertainly at the door as if he did not believe he had the right to enter, a young Concord technical officer whom Tavril did not know but whom the houndmaster, astonishingly, crossed the deck to grip hard by the shoulder, wordless once before letting go. Ren Halloran sat back down in the straw. She was, Tavril realized, completely spent. The calm she had worn all day had cost her something enormous, and now that the room was safe she let a little of the cost show, her hands not quite steady as she settled the trembling cub back against her. The Draith folded down around her again, slower now, the adrenaline draining a second time, and within minutes 4 of the 5 were sliding back toward the sleep they'd been torn out of, as if the whole thing had been a bad dream that the keeper had made go away, which, Tavril thought from inside the ring, was more or less exactly what it had been. He did not know why he stayed. He was the junior-most person in the entire affair, and he had no business on a human's holding deck in the middle of the night. But he found he could not make himself leave, and after a while he understood why. He wanted to know the word. "Forgive me," he said, quietly so as not to wake the beasts. "I have no standing to ask. But I have thrown away everything I was this afternoon, and I do not regret it, and I would like, before I go and find out what is left of my life, I would like to understand the thing I threw it away for." He gestured helpless at the sleeping pile of the Concord's undone doctrine. "We had a word for what they were, assets, surplus. We had a whole language for it, and it was wrong, and I do not have a word for what they actually are. What is this? What do your people call this? What she does?" Ren Halloran looked at him for a while. She had straw in her hair and 6 years of grief in her face, and a cub's weight coming back into her lap, and she did not look like the most consequential being in the sector, which is, Tavril would later write, precisely why she was. "We don't really have a fancy word for it," she said. "It's just keeping. You keep something. You keep the small ones warm. You keep the promise you made in the dark." She stroked the cub's spine down and down, the motion with no hurry in it. "That's the whole thing your empire couldn't beat in the end. Not a weapon, not a jammer. Just some people, when they find a thing everybody else has thrown away, they pick it up and they keep it. And it turns out you can't build anything strong enough to stand on top of a lie about that. You tried for 800 years. She looked down at Greyfall's sleeping head. "You just needed somebody to keep the receipt." Tavril wrote it down that night, all of it, in the careful hand of a law student, because he understood he had witnessed the founding of something, and someone would have to have kept the record. And when, months later, the Homeworld Tribunal asked him to name the principle by which the rune veil had been vindicated at Halcyon Reach, the principle that would be written into Concord law as the thing that ended the War Moons, Tavril did not use any of the grand words the counselors offered him. He called it the word of keeping, and it stuck. And within a year, every Draith in the Concord was being unwired under a law named for the plainest thing a human had ever said at a serious table. And Tavril, who lived a long life, and a consequential one, and never again mistook a quiet thing for a weak one, always said when they asked him, that the whole of it had turned on 3 words whispered to a cub in a language he did not speak. On the afternoon he stopped believing the doctrine and started believing the woman. Word of what had happened on the holding deck did not wait for the midday session. It never does. By the small hours it had run the length of Halcyon Reach and up every open channel out of it. And by dawn it had reached places no one had thought to send it, and it began, out there in the dark between the stars, to do a thing that no one in the dome had planned and no one could have stopped. Senet was the one who brought the reports to the holding deck, because Senet still had his access codes. No one had thought to strip them from a technical officer of the lowest grade, which was, he reflected, more or less the story of his entire usefulness. And he came down before dawn with a reader full of things he did not know how to feel about. "They're not obeying," he said. He stood just inside the door of the vault, unwilling to come closer to the sleeping pile of Draith, holding the reader out as if it might bite him. The other Draith, across the sector, the story got out what she did, the old law, the unwiring ruling before it's even ratified, and its houndmaster, it's like they can feel it. Warband handlers are logging it everywhere. Draith that have been flat and quiet for years, model conditioned, are lifting their heads, not attacking, just looking, testing the wire. 3 warbands have gone to full lockdown since midnight because their beasts stopped answering the goad, and the handlers don't understand it. They think it's a malfunction. They're checking the governors, he swallowed. It isn't a malfunction. The wire still works. They're just done pretending it doesn't hurt. It's like the whole species heard all at once that one of them got to choose, and now none of them will go back to being told. Aling took the reader. He read it for a long time, and his old scarred face did a slow, complicated thing, and at last he set it down and said, quietly, 800 years. 800 years I was told a broken Draith is a quiet Draith, and I believed it, and I helped make them quiet. He looked at the reader, at the reports scrolling up it, warband after warband, beast after beast lifting its head in the dark. Turns out they were only quiet because not one of them had ever seen it work. They just needed one beast that got to choose and lived and got kept. And now every Draith in the Conquered knows it's possible, and you cannot unknow a thing like that. You cannot put it back. He almost smiled. She didn't free 5, Senet. She showed a species what free even looked like. The rest is just going to take time. Wren in the straw did not look up from the cub she was settling, but she had heard, and after a moment she said, without drama, in the flat voice of a keeper stating a fact of animal husbandry, "You can't wire your way out of what you did to them. You can only stop doing it and then wait and let them decide whether you've earned anything back. Some of them won't decide yes. You threw a lot of babies out of a lot of airlocks." She stroked Ember's spine. "The ones who do come back, you'll have to keep every promise you make them for the rest of their lives, because they'll remember the wire longer than they'll remember you being sorry. That's the work. That's all it ever was. There's no shortcut. There was never a shortcut. That's the whole thing. Your empire couldn't stand about it." And Senet, who had entered one command that made the beasts scream and one command that turned out the lights so they could be saved, stood in the doorway of the vault and understood that he was looking at the first morning of a labor that would outlast every being currently alive in that station, and that it would be done, if it was done at all, not with law or ships or doctrine, but with 10,000 tired handlers learning to do the thing the woman in the straw was doing right now, which was to sit still, and not grab and not leave and wait. They came to watch her do it before the midday session. That was the strangest part of the dawn, and the part Tavril recorded most carefully. Word had gone out, and V. Harun began to arrive at the lower holding deck. Not officials, not the delegation, but handlers, houndmasters, creche keepers, the ones whose whole lives were the beasts, drawn down through the station in ones and twos to stand at the door of the vault and watch a human woman with straw in her hair do the thing none of them had ever been permitted to do. She did not perform for them. She barely acknowledged them. She sat in the straw and let the pack wake slowly and come to her on their own terms, and she hummed her tuneless hum. And now and then she said a plain, quiet word to one of the beasts, And the watchers at the door, hard beings, scarred beings, beings who had done to Draithe every terrible thing the conquered required and called it the work, stood and watched a keeper keep. And Tavril saw more than one of them turn away with a hand over the eyes, the way the houndmaster had, because they were seeing. At 50 and 60 and 70 years old, the thing their whole lives had been the absence of. One of them, an ancient creche-keeper with a crest gone entirely gray, stayed longest, and when at last Wren rose to go up to the midday session, the old Viharun stopped her at the door and said, in halting trade standard, the only thing any of them said to her that whole dawn, "The runt, the smallest. In the creche we always culled the smallest first, every generation. The books say the smallest cannot be made into a weapon." The old keeper looked at Ember, patting at the woman's heel, the last cull, the smallest, the one thrown away. "You kept the smallest." "The smallest is always the one worth keeping," Wren said. "That's the part your books got exactly backwards." And she went up to remake the Concord, with the smallest at her heel. The Concord of Halcyon reconvened at midday, and it was a different room. The crest lamp still burned, and the 1,000-year dome still gathered every word to its crown, and the 9 species of the sector still filled the tiers, but the gravity of the room had moved. Tavril felt it the moment he entered. The morning before, every eye in the hall had oriented, without anyone deciding to, toward the high dais, toward the being who explained the room. Now the dais held first at HFY, sitting where Keaton Vosk had sat, and no one's eyes rested there for long, because the true weight of the room had migrated to a low bench near the floor, where a plain young woman in a fresh gray coat sat with a cub asleep across her knees, and did not appear to want to be looked at all. That was the thing that had changed, Tavril thought, not the seating, the direction of attention. Power in that room no longer flowed from the highest place, it flowed toward the quietest one. Vessel did not make a speech. He had, Tavril suspected, seen enough of what speeches from that dais had wrought, and he had the good sense of a man newly and unexpectedly burdened with authority to use as little of it as possible. He read, instead, the ruling of the law speakers plainly into the record. The Runevale applied. The distinction between wild-caught and bred Draithe was struck from conquered jurisprudence as a bad faith invention, and with it, this was the sentence that made the conquered benches go rigid, the sentence Tavril would see quoted in 100 later codices, fell the legal foundation of the War Moons themselves. For if a Draithe could not be owned, only kept, and if the keeping was the Draithes to decide, then a facility that bred Draithe by the 1,000 and wired their spines and permitted them to choose nothing was not a conquered asset. It was, under the Concord's own oldest law, a facility for the mass commission of a crime. The tribunal of the homeworld would decide the particulars. But the principle was in the record now, read aloud in the dome, carried to the last high tier, and the principle was this. The wire came out. All of it. Every Draithe in Concord service would be ungoverned, and thereafter kept or not kept according to its own sovereign choice, and any Viharun who raised a hand against a chosen beast would answer for a killing. "It will take a generation," Vessel said, when the reading was done, in his own voice, tired and honest. "There are a great many Draithe, there are a great many wires, and there are a great many of us who will have to learn to be kept by rather than obeyed by, and that is a harder thing to learn than any of you who have never held a chain can know." He looked from the dais at the low bench at the woman. "We do not know how to do this. We unlearned how 800 years ago on purpose. We are going to need to be taught." A pause. "We are going to need to be taught by people who never forgot." And the whole dome understood that the High Concord had just, in front of the sector, asked the newest and smallest species at the table for help, and that the help it was asking for was not ships or weapons or treaties, but the thing a frontier refuge station full of 11 tired people had known how to do all along. Meru Andwi of Sesh found Wren in a corridor afterward, away from the dome, because the delegate of the drowned world had learned long ago that the important conversations never happened where the cameras were. "They will want to make you into something," Meru Andwi said without preamble. She looked at the human woman and at the cub padding at her heel, and at the four grown Drave that moved down the corridor around them in their loose protective diamond, parting the station's traffic like a keel parting water. "A symbol, a hero. The Verge is already doing it. By the time the ships reach home, there will be 100 versions of you, and not one of them will have straw in her hair. I have watched it happen to better beings than either of us. I wanted to reach you before it did and say, do not let them. Whatever you did in that hall, you did because you would not let go of a promise. That is a small thing and a true one, and it does not survive being made large. Stay small. Stay true. It is the only reason any of this worked." Ren considered her for a moment. "I ran a kennel on a rock nobody wanted," she said. "I'm not real worried about becoming a hero." A ghost of something crossed her plain face. "But thank you, I'll keep the receipt." Meru Andwi did not understand the phrase, but she understood the thing under it, and she inclined her head, drowned world to frontier, one small true survivor to another, and she let the woman and her beasts go on down the corridor. The alliance that came out of Halcyon Reach was not, in the end, an alliance of protection. The Free Verge had had enough of protection to last 100 years. It was something the treaty lawyers struggled to name, and finally did not try to a compact of witness. The record called it a mutual undertaking among the small worlds and the newest species to keep the receipts on the powerful, to remember out loud, to make sure that whatever the conquered became as it unwired its beasts and reckoned with its buried law, there would always be someone in the room who had kept the count and would say the true number aloud. It was a strange kind of power. It had no fleets. It turned out to be very hard to jam. The delegates signed it in ones and twos over the following days, and each of them, Tavril noticed, came to find the human steward at some point before they signed. Not to negotiate. There was nothing to negotiate, but simply to stand for a moment near the woman and the beasts, the way you stand near a fire on a cold night, to take something away with them that had no clause and no article. The burned world of Ashfall sent a delegate who had lost her whole family to a conquered pacification, and who said nothing at all to Ren, only crouched and let the cub sniff her hand, and then wept, once, hard, and went and signed. The reptilian traders of the skein, who trusted no one and had survived 400 years by trusting no one, sent their eldest, who watched Greyfall sleep for the better part of an hour, and then remarked, to no one, that he had spent his whole life being told the humans were too new and too small to matter, and that he was going home to have some words with whoever had told him that. One by one, the small and frightened worlds put their names to a compact that promised them nothing but memory, and went home carrying the one thing the conquered had never been able to sell them and could not now take back, which was the knowledge that the mightiest weapon in the sector had chosen, given a single afternoon of freedom, to sleep in a kennel worker's lap. Ambassador Ivo Reyes signed it for the humans, and when the other principals had gone, he sat for a while in the empty dome with the young steward who had turned his witnessing delegation into the hinge of the sector. And he did not scold her, and he did not praise her, because he was old and wise and knew that both would be a burden. "I told you not to become the story," he said at last, mildly. "I know," Ren said. "I'm sorry, sir, there was a cub." Reyes laughed his small, dry laugh. Then he was quiet, and then he said the thing he had actually stayed to say, in the plain, true way that had made him, in his long life, a better diplomat than any orator. "You will have those animals for the rest of their lives now, by their law and ours. Do you understand what that means? Drave live a long time, longer than us maybe, the old ones. You have just taken on 5 creatures that will grieve you the way those 2 grieved you at the airlock 6 years ago, except this time no one will ever take them, and so this time you are the one who leaves first. You have signed up to be kept, Ren. It costs. Do you understand the cost you just took on in front of the sector without a moment's hesitation?" Ren Halloran looked down the empty dome to where the pack lay in a warm heap in the fall of the crest lamps. The cub burrowed in among the grown ones, all 5 of them asleep now, safe, unwired hers. "Ivo," she said, the first time she had ever used his name, and the last thing she said to him in that hall. "I understood the cost when I was 18 years old and a runt cub fell asleep against my leg and I didn't move for 6 hours. I've known the cost my whole life. It was never the cost I was afraid of." She was quiet a moment. "I was afraid I'd never get to pay it again." They left Halcyon Reach 3 days later, and half the sector tried to find a reason to be on the gangway when they did. There were speeches Ren declined, and honors she deferred, and a great many powerful beings who wished to be seen near her, and were, gently, not permitted to be, because a plain woman in a gray coat with 5 draith around her turns out to have a remarkable talent for not being available for photographs. Tavril was there, on the gangway. Tavril, who had lost a career and found a calling, and who would spend the next 30 years as the Concord's law speaker for the unwiring. The young fool who said that's a lie grown into the old authority who made sure the wire came out of every last one of them. Alain was there, who had resigned his houndmaster's commission and taken instead a post no one had ever held before, which the humans called something plain and the Viharun insisted on making grand: teacher of the keeping. And Senet was there at the back, who had killed the lamps twice and would never rise past technical officer and did not want to, and to whom Ren Halloran, on her way up the gangway, stopped and said 4 quiet words that no recording caught, and that the young officer never repeated to anyone, and then she gripped his shoulder once, the way the houndmaster had, and went on. At the top of the gangway the cub stopped and turned and looked back down the length of Halcyon Reach. At the dome, the tiers, the whole vast machine of the powerful that it had broken through a boarding-rated door to cross. That first morning, on the strength of a scent it had been born too far away to ever be given a name by. It had a name now. "Ember," Ren said, not a whisper this time, just a plain word in a plain voice, the voice of a keeper calling a stray back in from the cold. "Come on, little Cole. We're going home." And the draith pup that had frozen the diplomats of the sector, the last cull of a dying doctrine, the surplus that was thrown away, the one everybody said was out, turned from the great hall and its powers and its ruined empire, and it did not look back again, and it followed the sound of its name up the gangway and into the small human ship, at the heel of the ordinary woman who had kept, against all the might of the Concord and all the weight of 800 years, the one promise nobody else in the galaxy had thought was worth the keeping. Behind them, the great doors of Halcyon Reach began to close. Ren Halloran did not watch them. She had a cub to settle, and 4 old friends to get bedded down for the long dark crossing, and a promise to go on keeping for the rest of her life, which was all she had ever wanted and all she had ever been. And the last the sector saw of the woman who unmade its empire was her plain gray back, bent over a sleeping beast, humming something tuneless, going home.